A verb is a part of speech that is an action word. It depicts movement, action, or a state of being. Now, when we look at verbs, one type of verb is a common verb. Now, some examples of common verbs are talk, sing, run, think, and drive. Then you have verbs that convey a state of being, such as to have or to be. Then you have linking verbs. We call them linking verbs because what they do is they link the subject to additional info. So, for example, with linking verbs, you have to be, the forms of to be, are, is, and were. Forms of to become, become, and became. For example, the horse became famous overnight. Another common linking verb, to seem, forms of to seem, seems and will seem. For example, Connie seems sad. Now there are some verbs that are both linking and common, and that's based on how they're used. For example, examples of verbs that are both action and linking are look, get, stay, smell, and feel. For example, smell being used as a common linking verb. The meat smelled funny, linking the subject meat with additional info, funny, describing the smell of the meat. Then smell as an action verb. He smelled the flowers.
ACT English sentence structure. Adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. So the comparative form of a word is used to compare two actions, and the superlative form of a word is used to refer to one in a group of three or more that is the outstanding example of the action. So when we're dealing with one-syllable adverbs, we use the suffix er or est, or we use the words less or least. So say we have the word late. To get to the comparative form of the word late, we just add the suffix er to make it later. So if we have two people and one person is late by an hour and the other person is late by 2 hours, we would refer to the person late by 2 hours as being the later one. And then if we have three or more people and one person is late by 3 hours, we would refer to them as being the latest person. So that's the superlative form, latest. So we're just adding these suffixes, and really in later we're just adding r, and in latest we're just adding st because we already had e from late. Now to look at this in a more negative sense, you could use the words less or least. So you could refer to one person as being less late and another person as being the least late. Now, when you have an adverb with two or more syllables, you don't use a suffix anymore. You just use the words more or most or less or least. So we have the word carefully, and if two people both do something carefully, you would say that one person did it more carefully. And you could also say that one person did it less carefully, depending on how you want to look at it. And then also with the superlative form, if you have three or more, you would refer to one person as doing it the most carefully. And then you can refer to the person who wasn't very careful as being doing something the least carefully. Now we do have something called irregular adverbs, and what I mean by irregular is that they're irregular in the way you form the comparative and superlative forms of the adverb. So for example, we have the word well. Now the comparative form of the word well is better, and the superlative form is the best. So as you can see, better and best aren't in any way close to the word well. And so you just have to be familiar with these irregular adverbs and be familiar with how to form the comparative and superlative forms of those words. So again, adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. And we use the comparative form when we're comparing two actions, and we use the superlative form when we're comparing 3 or more actions.
Today we want to go over just a few of the rules related to apostrophes and their use for showing possession of something. So you've got a noun that possesses something else and you want to show possession. Sometimes it can be confusing to know where exactly to put that apostrophe. Before the S, after the S, do I add an extra S? And so we just want to go over not all the rules related to the use of apostrophes, but just a few of the select ones. And I've got them on the board here behind me, so we're going to go over those briefly. Once again, apostrophes related to possession, not apostrophes in contractions or things like this, but to show possession. If there is a plural noun that ends in S, the apostrophe comes at the end, and there's no need to add an extra S. So when we think of the plural noun students, meaning more than one, and we want to talk about something that belongs collectively to the students, like their hats, the way you would write it is the students, apostrophe, hats. You would not include an extra S. It wouldn't be the students, apostrophe S, students' hats. It would just be the students' hats. Next, then, you have a plural noun that does not end in S. In this case, the apostrophe comes after the word, and then you do add an S. So in this case, the plural for man is men, and you want to talk about the men's meeting. So you put the word men, apostrophe, S, and meeting. So in the first one, it's a plural noun that ends in S. You just put the apostrophe and you're done. And the second one, the plural does not end in S, so you add the apostrophe, then the S, and what's possessed. And then finally, if you've got a singular noun that ends you've got a singular noun, it ends with the apostrophe S basically. So a singular noun, like our first one up here, we had a plural noun. The singular of students is student, and we want to talk about one student's hat. Then we put the word student, apostrophe S, hat. So it mimics this rule here, number 2. So a singular noun, you end with apostrophe S, the student's hat. For names that end in S, proper names, things like that, you don't have to add another S at the end, but it is customary to do so. So when you talk about the Joneses' house or Texas's weather, the way you do it is the word Texas, apostrophe S, weather. Now it would be fine, it would be acceptable if you just put Texas, apostrophe, weather, and people would know it means Texas's weather. And the same with Jones. The Joneses' house, you would put Jones, apostrophe, S, or you could put Jones and then apostrophe. Either would be acceptable, so it's not required to put the extra S, but it is customary. Now, you never use an apostrophe when you're just talking about like the Joneses themselves in the plural. The Joneses went to Africa. In that case, you put Jones and then ES. You don't put an apostrophe there at all. But anyway, in terms of apostrophes and possession, just to review and hopefully make it clear, if it's a plural noun that ends in S, all you do is put the apostrophe on the end. Students, hats. If it's a plural noun that does not end in S, then you put an apostrophe S, men's meeting, mice's feet. If it's a singular noun, then you just put the noun apostrophe S to show possession. With formal things like Jones and Texas, just an apostrophe at the end is fine, but if you put an apostrophe S, that would actually be more customary. I hope this has been clear. If not, or you'd like to learn more about this, then underneath this video, if you look right beneath the video, there's a link there. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has related information to this, more information about things related to this. And also on that website, you'll find a link there to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
ACT, English, sentence structure. An independent clause contains a subject and a verb, and it's a complete thought. So an independent clause can stand by itself, so it can be a sentence. Like the sentence, I am running. See here we have a subject, I, and then we have this verb phrase, am, and running. And so it's a complete thought. It can stand alone and be a sentence. Now sometimes independent clauses have other clauses grouped with them, but they can also stand alone. Now, a dependent clause also contains a subject and verb. However, it is an incomplete thought. And so we can take this independent clause up here and just add the word because to it, and it becomes a dependent clause. Because I am running still has a subject and a verb, but now we have the word because, and so it's a dependent clause. It's not a complete thought. You can't just say because I am running. You need something to go with it, like because I am running, I can't come to the meeting. And so that would be a complete sentence. So that's what a dependent clause is. Now, a noun clause can be a subject, a direct object, which I will abbreviate DO, an indirect object, abbreviated IO, or an object of a preposition. So a noun clause can begin with WH question words like what, which, when, where, who, or whom, and question words like how or if. Now, an adjective clause modifies a noun or pronoun. So an adjective clause begins with a word like who, whom, which, that, whose, when, where, why. And it's going to follow the word it modifies. Then finally we have an adverb clause, which modifies a verb, an adjective, another adverb, or an object of a preposition. Now, an adverb clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, because, since, unless, etc. And an adverb clause answers the question when, where, why, how, or to what degree, or under what condition. So that's a look at some different types of clauses.
Commas have many different functions, but their three primary functions are to separate clauses, join independent clauses, and they're used to avoid confusion. So since we talked about separating and joining clauses, let's first talk about what a clause is. A clause is a piece of a sentence. If you have a dependent clause, it is dependent on the rest of the sentence. It cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. It would be a fragment. If you have an independent clause, it would be able to stand alone as a sentence. It would be independently a sentence on its own. So dependent clause can't be a sentence by itself, depends on the rest of the sentence. Independent clause stands alone, can be a sentence all by itself. So let's look at how we can separate clauses with commas. You will use a comma to separate a dependent introductory clause from an independent clause. So one way that dependent clauses are used is as an introduction to a sentence. For instance, before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. We use this comma to separate the dependent clause. So before the game is dependent. You cannot say before the game all by itself and have it be a complete sentence. It's only a prepositional phrase. So it is a dependent clause. But then you have Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. This would be independent. It could stand all by itself. So we are separating the dependent introductory clause from the independent clause. before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. And you notice how you pause where that comma is. And a lot of times, that's why a comma is there, to get you to pause so that your sentence makes sense as you're reading it, either to yourself in a book or aloud to someone else. So, dependent clause as an introduction needs a comma. Now, let's look at if we kind of switch the order of the sentence up. Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. When we put before the game at the end of the sentence, we don't need to have that comma anymore. We only needed the comma whenever we wanted to pause to let people know that before the game was separate and to realize the action was happening after that. So Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. Here, we didn't actually have to put a comma because the independent clause came first. So we had our dependent clause at the end, no comma needed. Now this is in this situation. That doesn't mean there will never be a situation where you will have a dependent clause at the end that needs a comma. If you have several items in a series, you may still need a comma toward the end of the sentence. But if you're using an introductory phrase, if it comes at the beginning of the sentence, you need the comma. If it comes at the end of a sentence, generally you won't. Let's look at another way that we use commas to separate clauses. You will use a comma to separate two independent clauses joined by any of the following conjunctions. And a conjunction is basically a connector word. And, but, or, for, nor, so, and yet are common conjunctions. If you have two independent clauses, that means two phrases in a sentence that could stand as a sentence on their own, and they're connected by one of these conjunctions, then you will need a comma to separate those two. We are going to the movies, or we are going to a nice restaurant. So here's our conjunction, or. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. We are going to a nice restaurant is an independent clause. So the comma is needed to separate two independent clauses. Now, let's look at if we combine this sentence a different way. We are going to the movies or to a nice restaurant. Here, we have that or, which would be a conjunction, but let's look. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. To a nice restaurant is dependent. To a nice restaurant cannot stand by itself. We don't have a subject in that clause. In this version of the sentence, we had we are going still included. So we still had a subject and a verb, so this was a complete thought all by itself. So it was an independent clause. It could stand as a sentence. To a nice restaurant is missing that. It's missing both your subject and your verb. It's not been made a complete sentence, so it's dependent on the rest of the sentence to make sense. So in this instance, we did not have two independent clauses. So no comma was needed. Okay, now let's look at the second primary function of a comma. To join independent clauses, to avoid short, choppy sentences. So generally, whenever we are going to join independent clauses, we're doing it so that we don't have a series of short, choppy sentences. Now you're going to see that this might look a little similar to where we separated independent clauses. Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. Okay, and this one we had an independent clause, or a conjunction, and an independent clause. Let's look at the next version of this set of clauses. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. So Sarah plays softball. This is independent. Runs track is dependent. We have our conjunction, and enjoys swimming is dependent. Yet we still had those commas. And then let's look at the last version. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. So all three of these are going to be independent clauses because they are complete sentences. But they're short, choppy sentences. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. We keep hearing Sarah over and over, and these sentences are short. We can combine them to make it a smoother flowing sentence. So you could have two independent clauses joined by a conjunction like we did up here, and then you would use that comma to separate them. But you are still joining multiple sentences when you do that. So you're using those commas to separate the clauses, but you were using them to also join two sentences into one. So Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. So here we used our comma to join these two independent thoughts. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. Well, we had dependent clauses here, but we still had a conjunction. The reason we're going to put commas here is because you've got 3 or more items in a series. If you list 3 or more items or clauses, activities in a series, you're going to separate them with commas. So the reason we're using it here is to separate 3 or more items in a series. Here we were using it to separate 2 independent clauses. And then at the end we had no commas. We just had 3 complete sentences, which basically equaled 3 independent clauses. So we had to find ways to combine them. So we could combine all 3 into one sentence, and we could use our rule of using 3 or more commas in a series to join these different independent clauses. Or we could use our rule of separating 2 independent clauses with a comma and a conjunction and keep 2 independent clauses instead of separating it up and making it dependent clauses, but 3 different activities in a series. We could say Sarah collects bananas, apples, and tomatoes. We would have to put commas in that series too. Sarah collects bananas, comma, tomatoes, comma, and apples. So when you have 3 or more items in a series, you have to put your commas to separate them. This is going to be helpful when you're combining different ideas to be able to join independent clauses and in other instances. If you have just 2 sentences that you would like to combine, you can do so using a conjunction and a comma. As long as it's still an independent clause on each side, you will need that comma. Let's look at the third primary function of a comma. They are used to avoid confusion. I want to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn for dinner. Without a comma in this sentence, it sounds like you're saying you want to eat chicken broccoli. Well, you probably don't know what chicken broccoli is, and that's because it's not a real food. What would make more sense is if we said I want to eat chicken, comma, broccoli, comma, and corn for dinner. Then you would be telling someone you would like to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn. 3 items, not chicken broccoli, which makes chicken look like an adjective to broccoli. Now, this comma here in a series, if you have 3 or more items, the comma immediately before and is optional. Some people like the way it looks, some don't. I like the way the comma looks. It helps me feel more organized when I'm writing, so I always put it in. But you definitely need this comma because otherwise the meaning of your sentence is unclear and you would not be avoiding that confusion that commas are supposed to help you avoid. Let's look at the next example. Before we eat, our dog has to eat. This doesn't make sense. Before we eat our dog, you're not going to eat your dog. But if you're reading this sentence quickly, without a comma there to slow you down and make you pause, you don't read it correctly. You would have to read it a second or third time to get what the author's meaning actually was. So you would say, before we eat, our dog has to eat. And maybe this is so that your dog isn't going to bother you while you eat. If your dog's already eaten, then you can eat happily. So before we eat, our dog has to eat. And this is one of those dependent introductory clauses like we talked about up here. We use it to separate, we use a comma to separate clauses, and that can also avoid confusion. So you see how some of these rules tie in together. Commas in a series, commas in a series. Introductory clause being separated from the independent clause that is the rest of the sentence. Dependent clause separated from independent clause. So a lot of the rules of commas may overlap a little bit, but these are three of the primary functions you're going to see commas used for. That doesn't mean you won't see them used any other way. They're also used geographically if you're talking about a city inside of a country or inside of a state. If you're talking about dates or times, then you may also use commas. Commas are used in people's names sometimes if you're putting a junior or a senior. So these aren't the only times you're going to see commas, but in writing, these are the primary functions in which you are going to see commas used.
It is important that your writing is made up of complete sentences. In fact, it is essential that your writing only has complete sentences. So a complete sentence has a subject, a verb, and it is a complete thought. Toby went to school. Toby is the subject, went is the verb. And it's a complete thought. If someone said to you, Toby went to school, you wouldn't be asking for more information because this is a complete thought. Instead of riding a horse, we don't see a subject here, so we just see the verb riding. So we already know it's not a complete sentence because there's no subject. But in addition, it's not a complete thought. If someone said to you, instead of riding a horse, you'd be left asking for more information because it seems like this should go on longer and give you more information than it does. Shelby rode her horse instead of. So Shelby is the subject and rode is the verb. So we have a subject and a verb. We're looking good. But wait a second, this is not a complete thought. Again, it seems like this should go on farther than it does and give you more information. If it just said Shelby rode her horse, that would be fine. But since it says instead of, this phrase needs to continue on and give you more information. So this is also not a complete sentence. So again, remember the three elements of a complete sentence: a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. Many times in your writing, you will find that you have two short sentences that can be combined together. Now, in order to combine two sentences, they need to have the same subject matter. In other words, they need to be about the same things. You wouldn't want to have one sentence that's talking about a baseball game and another sentence that's talking about mowing the lawn connected together into one sentence. So the sentences need to be similar. So this first sentence says Joey will be at the park, and the second one says if he is not at the park, then he is doing homework. So these sentences are fine as they are, but we can combine them together because they're somewhat short and they're also talking about the same thing. So we have four different ways that we can combine these sentences. So let's take a look at A. Joey will be at the park and he will be doing homework. Now, the sentence is well put together. However, it changes the meaning of these first two sentences because up here it's saying Joey will be at the park, and if he's not at the park, then he's going to be doing homework. So he's either going to be at the park or he's going to be doing homework. It's one or the other. Here, this is saying that he will do both. So we know that's wrong. We go to B. Joey will be at the park before he does homework. We don't see that either because, again, this is saying that Joey's going to go to the park and do homework. and he's just going to do one or the other. We go to C, Joey will be at the park if he does homework. No, these two sentences don't say anything about him doing both. This is saying that he will be at the park if he gets his homework done. But remember, this up here indicates that it's an either-or situation. He's either going to be at the park or he's going to be doing homework. So we get to D. Joey will be at the park or he will be doing homework. This sentence right here combines these two sentences very well. It makes the two sentences mesh together very well into one sentence. That way, the reader only has to read one sentence instead of two, and it does not change the meaning of the first two sentences. That's key. You never want to change the meaning when you combine two sentences. Whenever you write anything, whether that's just a sentence, a paragraph, or a whole story, you always want to go back and edit what you have written. And so the process of editing is where you read everything that you have written down and you make sure that it's correct. When there's mistakes in your writing, oftentimes the audience will pay more attention to your mistakes than the information you're trying to convey to them. In addition, if your mistakes are too bad, it will make it where the reader cannot understand what you were trying to say. So let's take a look at this example paragraph and see what needs editing. The first sentence says, Andrew planted a tree. It was a sunny day. What we have here is a run-on sentence. That's two sentences that are just connected together in an incorrect way. So this first phrase, Andrew planted a tree, has a subject and a verb, so it's a whole sentence. And the second phrase says, it was a sunny day, so we have the subject, it, and the verb was. So these are two sentences that are joined together incorrectly. So a run-on sentence is a sentence that just goes on too long. So there's a number of ways that we can correct this. We could put comma and. So the sentence would read, Andrew planted a tree and it was a sunny day. Or we could put a period here and make it capitalized, and we can say Andrew planted a tree, it was a sunny day. Those are correct. But I think what the best way to do this is to get rid of the period, get rid of it and was, and put the word on. So now it reads, Andrew planted a tree on a sunny day. So that's just one sentence, and that's correct. The next sentence says, first he got a shovel and the tree. Whenever you read a phrase at the beginning of a sentence, like first, it needs a comma in front of it, because a comma tells the reader to pause. So now the reader will read this sentence like, first, he got a shovel and the tree. The next sentence says, he dug a hole, will plant the tree, and watered it. So the problem with this sentence has to do with verb tenses. So we see the verb dug right here. This is what we call past tense, because it happened in the past. He dug a hole. That indicates that he dug the hole yesterday or maybe a week ago. And then in this last phrase it says he watered it. That's also in the past tense. It's indicating that he watered the tree maybe yesterday or the week before. But we get to this phrase which says he will plant the tree. Will plant is future tense. This sounds like he's going to plant the tree in the future, but we know that he already has planted the tree. So we need to change the words will and plant to the verb planted. Now all the verbs are in past tense, so this sentence has what we would call consistency. He dug a hole, planted the tree, and watered it. Now the last sentence says, a pine tree is what he planted. This sentence is clear. You can understand what the author is trying to convey to you. However, it could be worded in a better way. So we could say, he planted a pine tree. So these two sentences are saying basically the same thing, but this new sentence sounds better than this first sentence. So again, the process of editing is reading everything that you have written, and a lot of times it helps if you read everything out loud and you find any mistakes that you have made and then you correct those mistakes.
There are two primary uses for the semicolon in the English language. The first is to separate two closely related independent clauses within a sentence. If you use a semicolon, there's no need to include a coordinating conjunction such as and. The second use for a semicolon is to separate items in a list when the items are long and complicated or contain internal punctuation such as a comma. Ordinarily, you would use a comma to separate items in a list, but if the items contain commas within them, it may be confusing to separate the items with a comma. So that's where the semicolon comes in. Here we have one example sentence for each usage. In this first one, we have two independent clauses separated by a semicolon. So each of these clauses could stand on its own as a sentence, but we've chosen to combine them into a single sentence, and we do so with a semicolon. It's proper to use a semicolon in this sentence because the two phrases, I went to the doctor and he told me I had the flu, are very closely related to one another. Hearing that you have the flu is a direct result of going to the doctor. You would not, for instance, be able to use a semicolon in a situation where your two clauses were, I went to the doctor, I scored a 99 on my exam, because they're not related in the same way that these are. So in order to use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses, the two clauses must be very closely related to one another. The second example was items in a list. So as you can see here, we've got three items, and they are city-state combinations. So you'll recall the proper way to list out cities and states is city, comma, state. So each item has an internal comma. So it could be confusing to try to separate them with commas. So the proper usage in this instance is to use a semicolon to separate each of them. So these are the two primary uses for semicolons in English.
Adjective clauses and phrases are groups of words that collectively play the role of an adjective. So I want to take a look at examples of a clause and a phrase. So let's take a look at this first sentence. It says, the car that is parked in the yard is mine. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this first example is an adjective clause. And adjective clauses contain both a subject and a verb. So the adjective clause in this sentence contains both a subject and a verb. So we're looking for this clause in this sentence. So like I said, adjective clauses collectively play the role of an adjective. So we're looking for a group of words that describe another word in the sentence. So if you look right here at that is parked in the yard, it's marked off by commas. And that is parked in the yard plays the role, or could play the role, of an adjective because it's describing the word car. So if we look at this clause right here, we notice that it contains both a subject, that, and is, which is a verb. And parked is also a verb. So that is parked in the yard. And so what is parked in the yard? The car is parked in the yard. So that is parked in the yard is further describing the word car. So this right here is an adjective clause. And adjectives can often be removed from a sentence, and the sentence will still make sense. And if you notice right here that this phrase or this clause right here is marked off by two commas. And any time a group of words is marked off by two commas, it can be removed from the sentence, and the sentence will still make sense. So take a look at this. Just X this out. We don't even read that, and we just read the sentence as that, or the car is mine. The sentence still makes sense without this adjective clause. And so that's another way to be able to tell that this is an adjective clause because it can be removed from the sentence. Now, we've talked about adjective clauses. So as you can guess, this next example is going to be an adjective phrase. The sentence is very similar to the first, except it's missing two words. So those two words are that and is. Instead of saying that is parked in the yard, the sentence just picks up with parked. It says parked in the yard. So let's read the sentence as a whole. The car parked in the yard is mine. So this right here is going to be the adjective phrase. Why? Because it doesn't contain both a subject and a verb. It's missing the subject, which is that, and the verb, which is parked. Well, parked is still in this phrase, which is a verb, but it's missing part of its verb, which is, and it's missing a noun, or it's missing its subject, that. So this phrase doesn't have a subject and a verb, so that's why we call it an adjective phrase, because phrases don't have both a subject and a verb. So parked in the yard is the adjective phrase, because there's no one word in here that's describing car, but collectively these words make an adjective phrase which further describe the word car. The car parked in the yard. So parked in the yard is telling you where the car is parked. So there you've seen a quick preview to give you a better understanding of what adjective clauses and adjective phrases are and how they can be used. When you have adjectives in a series, sometimes they are divided up by commas and sometimes they are not. So I want to take a look at when you need to use a comma and when you don't need to use a comma. This first sentence says, an interesting blue box. Now you notice that interesting and blue are both adjectives because they describe box. But do you need a comma between interesting and blue? The answer is you do not, because there's a simple test you can use to decide whether you need a comma or not. The question is, can you use or can you insert and or but in between the two adjectives? So if we insert and between interesting and blue, would it make sense? Interesting and blue box. That doesn't really sound right. You wouldn't say that in a sentence. Can we insert the word but? Interesting but blue box? That really doesn't make sense either. So since we can't insert and or but in between the two words, then we don't need a comma. So take a look at this next sentence. It says, a serious, kind man. Serious and kind are both adjectives describing man. And a comma separates the two adjectives. Why? Because try inserting and between the two adjectives. A serious and kind man. Well, that doesn't really sound right because serious and kind are totally opposite. So let's try inserting but. A serious but kind man. That would make sense. You could write a sentence using that phrasing. So we are going to put a comma in between these two words. Now, although that's a test to figure out whether we need a comma or not, that's not really the reason you need a comma or the reason you don't need a comma. The reason is there's a certain order that adjectives come in. And it's not very easy to describe what order those adjectives need to come in, but when you speak English for a little bit, you just get a feel for what order the adjectives need to come in. So basically, if you have adjectives that are alike, that are kind of describing the same attributes of something that the adjective is describing, then you need to use a comma. In other words, serious and kind are both observations someone can make about a man. They're very similar adjectives, so you need a comma. Now, in this sentence, interesting and blue aren't alike adjectives. Blue is describing the color. It's describing the physical description of the box. Interesting doesn't tell us anything about the physical description of the box. It's just an observation. So right here you have an observation and a physical description adjective, both describing box, so you don't need a comma. But here you have an observation adjective, serious, and another observation adjective, kind, used to both describe the word man. So serious and kind needs a comma. Let's look at another example, an exciting, interesting box. So here we do need a comma because you could say exciting and interesting box. That would make sense. Exciting and interesting are both observations. So both of these adjectives are very alike. So you use a comma. Now let's take a look at this example, a short, stubby tree. All right, let's try inserting the word but between short and stubby. A short but stubby tree. That doesn't really make sense because short and stubby are alike. Now let's try inserting and. A short and stubby tree. That makes sense. And so we need a comma. Why? Because short and stubby are similar adjectives. They both describe the size of the tree. They both describe the physical description of the tree. So the important thing to take from this is you need a comma when you can insert and or but between the two adjectives, and you don't need to insert a comma when you can't insert a comma between the two adjectives. And in this case, I'm only using 2 adjectives. Well, sometimes you may only have 1 adjective for a certain word, which that's fine too, and you don't even have to deal with the question as to whether or not to use a comma. And now sometimes you will have 3 adjectives for a certain word, and the same rules apply. You may or may not need a comma between the words. And when you get to have more than 3 adjectives, you are probably using too many adjectives. There may be rare cases where 4 or 5 adjectives are acceptable, but generally you're only going to have 1, 2, or 3 adjectives describing a specific word. Adverb clauses and adverbial phrases are groups of words that play the role of an adverb. So let's take a look at this example sentence on the board. When I complete this task, we can go. Now the meat of this sentence, the subject and verb of this sentence, comes in the later part of the sentence. We can go. We right here is the subject, and can go is the verb phrase. So when I complete this task could actually be removed from the sentence, and the sentence would still make sense. We can go makes perfect sense by itself. So when I complete this task then is an adverb, because adverbs aren't necessarily important to a sentence. You can remove an adverb and the sentence will still make sense without it, because adverbs just merely modify or further describe another word in the sentence. So since we can remove when I complete this task from the rest of the sentence, then it is probably our adverb clause, and it is. Now there's not one word in this adverb clause right here that actually would be an adverb by itself. It's the group of words right here together that modify the verb can go, or the verb phrase can go, because can and go together make up the verb phrase. So when I complete this task is our adverb clause, and it modifies can go. It's answering the question when. When can we go? When I complete this task, because adverbs often answer a question. So the question here is when, and it's saying when I complete this task. Now notice that it's called a clause. It's called an adverb clause, and that's because clauses contain both a subject and a verb. And that is the case with this group of words right here. You see a subject and a verb. I is the subject, and complete is the verb. All right, so let's look at this next sentence. In a moment, the pizza will be ready. Here, the meat of our sentence is, again, in the later part of the sentence. Pizza is the subject, and will be is the verb phrase. So here again, in a moment, could be removed from the sentence. In a moment, the pizza will be ready. Now let's try reading the sentence without this. The pizza will be ready. The sentence still makes sense, so this is probably our adverbial phrase. Now notice this time, it's called an adverbial phrase instead of an adverb clause. Well, what's the reasoning behind that? The reasoning is a clause contains both a subject and a verb. A phrase does not contain a subject and a verb. And here, there's no subject and there's no verb. So that's why it's called an adverbial phrase. This group of words right here, in a moment, describes or modifies will be. Again, it's answering the question when. When will the pizza be ready? It'll be ready in a moment. So the important thing to remember is the main distinction between adverb clauses and adverbial phrases. Adverb clauses are a group of words that modify another word. But the adverbial clause, or the adverb clause, contains both a subject and a verb. In the case of an adverbial phrase, it again is a group of words that modifies another word. But in this case, the adverbial phrase does not contain a subject and a verb. Brackets can be used several ways in sentences. However, you as a writer need to be extremely careful when using brackets, and you need to be careful not to overuse them. So let's take a look at some examples of when it is okay to use brackets. But remember that you need to use brackets sparingly. So this quotation says, I am very excited. Now, if you as a writer were going to include this quotation in a sentence, you would need to amend this quotation slightly to make it more understandable on the reader's part. So we could say, I am very excited to be here. Now notice I put the words to be here in brackets. That's because that's not something the speaker said. That's something I added into the sentence. So that's why it's in brackets, to show the reader that it's not something the speaker actually said. However, all the words in brackets are still inside the quotation marks because I wasn't saying something contrary to what the speaker said. I'm saying something the speaker probably would have said but didn't. I'm just further clarifying what the speaker said. You can also put words in brackets when you need to change the pronoun form or the verb form of a sentence to help it make sense. Like say I'm talking about the past tense. I could say, I was very excited, and put that in quotation marks. So I put was in a bracket because I changed the verb form. And so brackets just lets the reader know that that's something that the writer amended in that sentence. Another time you can use brackets is if you need to include some extra information inside parentheses. So say you're going along in a sentence, these are just words, then you need to add something and you put it in parentheses. But then you need to add something else inside the parentheses. You could put some words, so there's words inside the parentheses. You want to further clarify, so you put some words in brackets and then close it off with parentheses. So brackets are just used inside parentheses. However, use this sparingly. It's okay to use parentheses around things, but you need to put brackets inside parentheses extremely sparingly. There's not very many instances in which you need to use both parentheses and brackets. So again, use brackets sparingly because lots of brackets make it difficult on the reader's part. However, there are some instances when it's appropriate, like the ones I wrote up here on the board. Choosing the correct adjective can sometimes be difficult, especially in certain confusing cases. One of those cases is whether or not to use less or fewer. That is the question. And a lot of people get this confused, so I don't want this to hold you up. Less is used when you're talking about things that aren't countable. Like you would say, there is less sand on this beach than the beach we were at last weekend, because sand's not something that's countable. You use fewer when you're referring to something that is countable. Like, there are fewer doors on this house than the last house we lived in, because doors is something that's very countable. Let's take a look at some examples. There are fewer people over here. People is something that's countable, so we use fewer. This sentence says there is less water in this river. Now, you could argue that water is something countable, because you could think, oh, you can count water in gallons of water. But we're not talking about gallons of water. We're just talking about water in general, and water is not something that's countable. So we use the adjective less. There is less water in this river. Now, this next sentence combines cases in which we can use less and fewer. It says, use less sugar when making fewer cookies. Sugar is not something that's countable. I mean, of course, you could count each individual grain of sugar, but overall, sugar is not countable. So we use the adjective less. And then we continue on to the sentence. It says, use less sugar when making fewer cookies. Cookies is something that's very countable, so we use the adjective fewer. Now, finally, there is a case which makes this whole case kind of more confusing. When you're talking about something that contains a number, when you're talking about numerical things, you use the adjective less. So this sentence says the shirt will cost less than $20. Now you may think that dollars is something that's very countable. It is, but to be grammatically correct, you use the adjective less. This shirt will cost less than $20. Or this purchase will consume less than 45% of my budget. If you're using a percentage or any kind of statistical or numerical thing in a sentence, you use the adjective less. So that's just a side note you need to remember. But overall, you use less when you're talking about something that's not countable. And you use fewer when you're talking about something that is countable. Today we're going to talk about commas. Now, commas have three main functions: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion. So let's take a look at the first use, to separate clauses. This is when you need to separate a dependent clause from an independent clause, as is the case with this sentence. Michael went to the beach after he got ice cream. Michael went to the beach is the independent clause, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, to test whether a clause is a dependent clause is just read that clause by itself. So if we were to read after he got ice cream, we would realize that's a dependent clause. It's dependent on the independent clause to make sense. Because if I just say after he got ice cream, that doesn't make very much sense. You're thinking, okay, what happened after he got ice cream? So Michael went to the beach is the independent clause because it can stand by itself, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, dependent clauses can actually come before or after an independent clause. In fact, they can actually come inside the independent clause as well. So we could reverse this sentence and we could say, after he got ice cream, Michael went to the beach. There again, after he got ice cream is still the dependent clause, and Michael went to the beach is still the independent clause. The sentence is just constructed differently. Now, a second use for commas is to join independent clauses. This is when basically you have two sentences that are closely related and you want to join them together. So if we were to say Taylor plays basketball, and then we also had another sentence, he enjoys running, we can easily join those two together. There's a couple ways to do that, but one of the ways is to use a comma and a conjunction. So we can say Taylor plays basketball, comma, and he enjoys running. The comma helps bring these two sentences together, and it helps you realize what's happening, that you're adding two sentences together. Now, the third use is to avoid confusion. There's a couple times when you want to do this. First would be when you're putting words in a list or items in a list. So if I were to say, I got a baseball, bike, and trampoline, I need commas to separate all three of the items. Now, sometimes you can leave the second comma off, and that can be fine as well. But you need at least one comma in here so people realize that it's a list. Because if I don't have a comma right here, it just looks like I got a baseball bike, and people are trying to figure out what is a baseball bike. Now, most people can pretty much figure out what you're trying to say, but a comma right there makes it so much easier for the reader because they can easily look at this and think, okay, you got a baseball, a bike, and a trampoline. Now, another time that you need a comma to avoid confusion is when someone just reading the sentence could easily get it mixed up, okay? So if I were to say, after we ate, our dad left for work, okay? So with the comma in here, it's easy to read that. After we ate, our dad went to work. The family was eating, they got finished, and the dad left for work, okay? But if the comma's not there, it can make it kind of confusing. The first time someone reads this, they're gonna think, after we ate, our dad left for work. And so they're thinking, wait, they ate their dad? No, of course not. And a reader eventually, yes, is probably going to figure out what the person's trying to convey that wrote the sentence. But it makes it so much easier if you have a comma right here because it makes it so much easier for the reader to understand what's going on. And sometimes, in certain cases, if a writer leaves out a comma, it can make it very hard, almost impossible, for the reader to try to understand what the writer was trying to convey. And as a writer, anytime you're writing something, you want to convey things in such a way that people can easily read them and pick up what you're trying to convey. All right? So then again, commas, three main uses: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion. A complete predicate consists of both the verb of a sentence and the words around it, the words that modify the verb and complete its meaning. So in this sentence, he is the subject. And so I'm going to put one line under it. And ran is the verb of the sentence. So he ran a long way. So just a simple predicate would just be the verb right here, ran. But we're looking for a complete predicate here. So a complete predicate is going to be all the sentences that modify and further describe the verb. So ran a long way is the complete predicate in this sentence. Generally, all the words that come after the verb are going to be part of the predicate. So you see right here, the subject's right here, then the verb. So all these words past the verb is going to be part of the predicate. That's not always true, but generally you can determine the predicate that way. This next sentence says, the elderly mayor retired yesterday. So mayor is the subject, so I'll put one line under that word, and retired is the verb. So yesterday right here is also part of the predicate. So the complete predicate would be retired yesterday. Now the reason yesterday is part of the predicate is because I said that any words that modify the verb or further describe the verb are part of the predicate. Well, yesterday is what we call an adverb, which is a word that modifies the verb, because yesterday is telling when the mayor retired. So yesterday further explains the verb retired. So that's why yesterday is part of the predicate. So retired yesterday would be the complete predicate of that sentence. This last example says, I wrote a paper last night and turned it in this morning. Well, this sentence looks kind of complicated when determining the predicate, but it's actually pretty easy. I is the subject. Now the verb right here is going to be wrote. So the complete predicate is going to be wrote a paper last night. Now, and right here is what we call a conjunction because it joins two parts of a sentence together. But right after and, we see another verb, which is turned. Turned is a verb. So turned it in this morning is also going to be the complete predicate. So right here, we see a subject, two complete predicates joined together by a conjunction. So sometimes sentences are going to have two complete predicates. So the important thing to remember here is that a complete predicate consists of the verb and any words that modify or further explain the verb. When writing, it's important to have consistency in your use of punctuation. So you never want to alternate punctuation. So say you started a phrase with a comma, you wouldn't want to end it with a dash. Now it's also important to use these types of punctuation in pairs, like such as dashes, parentheses, or commas. You always want to use those in pairs because if a section of text has an opening dash, parentheses, or comma at the beginning of a phrase, then there should be a matching closing dash, parentheses, or comma at the end of the phrase. So we're going to take a look at some examples of the use of dashes, commas, and parentheses. So you always want to use parentheses in pairs. So here we see the sentence, after removing the fence, wear gloves, feed the pigs. So notice we have parentheses here and here. We wouldn't just use one by itself, or we wouldn't use parentheses here and a dash or a comma over here. The reason we have a comma here has nothing to do with the parentheses. It's just because we need to put a comma after this phrase, after removing the fence. So we always use parentheses in pairs. Now, we also always use dashes in pairs. Now, say we had two words like long-term projects. Here we would hyphenate long-term and put a hyphen right there. So a hyphen is different than a dash, but to us they often look the same and we kind of get them confused. So right, with a hyphen, you're just going to use it by itself there. But with a dash, you're always using it in pairs. But I just wanted to point that out so I didn't confuse you. So here we have the sentence, the two guys wearing hats, Brian and Andrew, play football. So we have a dash here, setting off Brian and Andrew, and then we have another dash to end it. And then with use of commas, sometimes we need to use them in pairs. As a general rule, we do use them in pairs. So like after the game we went to eat, notice we only have one comma. But let's go ahead and look at this sentence. My friend, the guy in the green shirt, plays baseball. And I need a period right there. So right here we see a comma, and we see another comma, because it's setting off this phrase right here. So we need two commas, because commas often set off certain phrases that don't have to be there, because we could just say, my friend plays baseball. But we use two commas here. Now the reason we only use one is because technically the other comma would go before after, because we could just say we went to eat, but we're adding in after the game. But it would be silly to put a comma at the beginning of a sentence. It works the same way if this sentence was reversed. If we said we went to eat after the game, we'd put a comma before after, and we just put a period after game instead of another comma. So usually you're going to use it in pairs, but there are exceptions. Then many times you use commas for items in a series, like I enjoy playing basketball, baseball, football, and soccer. I'd put a comma after all of those different sports. Well, in that case, I would only end up with 3 commas instead of 4. And so that's an odd number. So they're not always going to be used in pairs when you use them for items in a series. So again, make sure you don't alternate punctuation, and make sure that if you're using dashes, parentheses, or commas, that you have the punctuation to open up the phrase, and you have the punctuation there to also close the phrase. Dashes have two main functions. One, they can be used in place of commas in order to set off a certain part of the sentence. Or two, they can be used to show a pause in a quotation. So let's take a look at the first use. 2 states on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So right here, Washington and Oregon could be omitted from the sentence. So try reading the sentence without Washington and Oregon in the sentence. 2 states on the West Coast have amazing weather. That sentence still makes perfect sense. So Washington and Oregon is just extra information. So what's one way you can set off additional information? Through the use of commas. So we could just put a comma right here after coast and a comma right here after Oregon. But in this case, the writer chose to use 2 dashes. So here the sentence reads, 2 states on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So here you pause and where the dashes are. Just like you would pause when you see a comma, pause where the dashes are. So it's 2 states on the West Coast, Washington and Oregon, have amazing weather. So that's one way to use dashes, just to set a certain part off of the sentence from the rest of the sentence. Now also dashes can be used to show a pause in a quotation. Like right here, go to the left, turn right. So right here the speaker is telling the driver to go to the left, and then they pause for a second and realize that they actually need to go to the right, so they're saying turn right. So the dash right here is showing that the speaker thought for a minute, because otherwise the sentence wouldn't make sense without the dash, because the sentence would just read, go to the left, turn right. So the dash is needed here to show the reader that the speaker paused, thought about it, and then changed their mind. A dash can also be used at the end of the sentence if a speaker suddenly stops what they are saying. So it could be like, I was headed this way, then there's a dash, and then it could be Jim froze in fear when he saw the bear. So dashes can also be used at the end of a quotation. So just remember the 2 main ways that dashes can be used. Dashes aren't used very often, so use them sparingly and only when needed. Adjectives can take on different forms when they're being used to compare 2 or more things. Let's take a look at this example on the board. We have the word fast. That is an adjective in its most basic form. So if we were going to compare 2 things to each other, we would use the adjective faster. So an example of this adjective right here, fast, would be saying, look at that fast person. Now if we were comparing 2 people, Jim and Steve, we would say Jim is faster than Steve. You wouldn't say Jim is fast than Steve. You would say Jim is faster than Steve, because you're comparing 2 people. So we're going to call this form of the adjective the comparative form. And you can do this with other adjectives besides fast. You could use tall and then taller, or pretty and then prettier. So we call this the comparative form, and the comparative form is generally found by adding ER to the adjective. So this is fast right here in its basic form. Then we add ER to it to make it faster, and it's in its comparative form to compare 2 people or 2 objects. So you could say that car is faster than the other one. Now, let's look at the word fastest. We changed fast into fastest by adding EST. This is the superlative form of fast. The superlative form is used when you're comparing 3 or more objects or people. So you could say Jim is the fastest runner on his track team, because there's many athletes on his track team and he's the fastest. Or you could say this is the fastest car that this dealership sells. It's used when you're comparing 3 or more things. So remember, that's called the superlative form. Now let's take a look at this played out in some sentences. So this first sentence says, she is a kind person. Kind is the adjective here because it's describing person. Now, if we want to look at the comparative form of kind, we would add ER to it to get kinder. So when we're comparing her to her sister, we would use kinder. She is kinder than her sister, or she is a kinder person than her sister. And then this last sentence, we would say she is the kindest person in her family, because there's 3 or more people in her family, and she's the most kind in all of her family. So we would say kindest because it's comparing 3 or more people. Now, like I said, to get the comparative form, you add ER to the adjective. And to get the superlative form, you add EST. Now, sometimes adjectives are not always that easy. There's some words which we call irregular pronouns. Take the word good, for example. Like, he is a good piano player. Now, if you say that he is gooder than he used to be, in other words, he's improved, you wouldn't say he is gooder than he used to be. That doesn't make sense. The next word would be better. He is better than he used to be. Or he is a better piano player than John. Now, if you wanted to say he is the bestest player he has ever been, that doesn't make sense either. You would say he is the best player that he has ever been, or he is the best player out of all of his brothers. So you see here that even in this comparative form and superlative form, even though this is kind of irregular, ER still exists in the comparative form like it does with the word faster, and EST still exists in the superlative form like it did in fastest. Now let's look at one more kind of funny word. We have the adjective happy. Now if we want to change this to the comparative form, we can't leave the Y. We have to change the Y to an I. So if we write it like that, it does make sense. Happier. And then the superlative form would be happiest. Because if you left this I right here as a Y, that wouldn't be grammatically correct. It needs to have an I right here instead of a Y. So the important thing to take from this session is that you have an adjective in its regular form, which then can be changed to the comparative form when comparing it between itself and one other thing. Like when you're comparing 2 people or 2 objects, you use the comparative form. And when you're comparing 3 or more people or objects, so if you're comparing 3 people to see who is the fastest, then you use the superlative form. Or if you're comparing 25 people to see who is the fastest, you still use the superlative form. Direct and indirect objects play important roles in sentences, so it's important that you can identify them. So first, let's take a look at direct objects. Direct objects are basically the receiver of the action of a sentence. So the verb is telling what's going on, and the direct object is telling who that action is occurring to. So take a look at this sentence to see what I mean. He sold his car. So the verb right here is sold. Okay, so what is being sold in this sentence? The car is being sold. So I'm going to write D-O above it, okay, because it's called a direct object. So D-O stands for direct object. He sold his car. That car is the direct object. Look at this sentence. He washed clothes. Washed is the verb. He is the subject. So what is he washing? He is washing clothes. The clothes are being washed. So again, I'm going to write D-O because that's the direct object. Now an indirect object is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's indirect. So right here in this sentence it says the man gave his wife a necklace. So the direct object here is a necklace because that's what's being given. Man is the subject, gave is the verb. So the man gave what? The man gave a necklace. So that's the direct object. But what about his wife? Now the man didn't give his wife, so wife can't be the direct object. But instead wife is the indirect object. Why? Because the wife is receiving the necklace from her husband. Look at this sentence. The sun gave my skin a sunburn. So what's the direct and indirect objects here? Well, the direct object can't be my skin because the sun isn't giving my skin. The sun is giving a sunburn. So sunburn is the direct object. So this indirect object here is skin. So I'm going to write I-O. Okay, because the sun is giving a sunburn. So you can ask the first question, what is the sun giving? The sun is giving a sunburn, so that's the direct object. And then you could ask the question, who is the sun giving a sunburn to? And the indirect object would be skin, because it's giving a sunburn to my skin. So the important thing to remember is the direct object is the action receiver in the sentence. And the indirect object is, like I said, it's indirect. Just keep asking questions, okay? The man gave. What did the man give? He gave a necklace. Who did he give the necklace to? His wife.
Drafting a thesis statement. The thesis statement expresses the main idea of a composition. It should encompass every idea, detail, and argument in that one thesis statement. It should all relate in some way to the thesis. So your thesis isn't going to list out all of your arguments and details that you're going to have in your composition, but it should relate in some way to all of them. A thesis can be kind of tricky because you want it to be general enough to encompass everything that's going to be in your paper, but specific enough that the reader knows what your main idea is. It should be a short declarative statement, but it should not be vague. It needs to be specific. It can't just be a general subjective sentence that doesn't really tell the reader what's going on. The thesis statement should suggest the content of the rest of the piece so the audience knows what to expect. And if you're too vague, the audience isn't going to know what to expect. So you have to be specific without being too specific, and general without being too general. So I'll give you a few examples so you can see how to balance these things and draft an effective thesis statement. The principal is basically a nice guy. It tells you the principal's nice, but there are lots of things you could talk about that would make the principal a nice guy. This is a pretty vague statement, so let's improve upon that. Let's get more specific and give the reader more of an idea of what the content of your piece is going to be. The principal's policies demonstrate his care for students. So now, the reason we think he's a nice guy is because it's obvious that he cares for his students based on his policies. So we're not talking about the principal being a nice guy because he coaches Little League or he just says hi to you in the hallway. It's because he has policies at school that show that he cares about his students. So this is an effective thesis statement. This is a good one. This one is too vague. We had to get more specific. So let's look at another example. Dogs are good pets. Well, not everyone's going to think that, but at least if you give them more information, they may see your side of things. Saying dogs are good pets is still really vague. You need to get more specific. Why do you think they're good pets? But don't get too specific because you want your main idea to be in your thesis statement, but you don't want all the supporting details to be there. You want to save those for the body of your paper. So let's look at this this is an effective thesis statement example, changing dogs are good pets, which is still too vague, to something more effective. Because of its sense of loyalty, its ability to be trained, and its good companionship, a dog is the perfect pet for me. Now, this thesis does actually tell you what your main subtopics are probably going to be. You'll probably have a body paragraph talking about a dog's sense of loyalty, another one about how easy they are to train, and another one about how they are good companions. This kind of thesis statement is also okay because it gets specific, but not too specific. It tells what your subtopics are going to be, what your supporting overall ideas are going to be, but it doesn't get into every detail and argument that you're going to present in your composition. So this would be another good example. So one of the main things to remember when writing your thesis statement is to include the main idea of your paper. Let the reader understand what they should expect from the rest of your paper, but don't be too vague or too specific. try to focus on a short declarative statement that tells the overall idea of your paper without giving it all away. Drafting body paragraphs. Body paragraphs should follow the thesis statement of a composition. And this is both in the order they are written and that all the body paragraphs are going to support the thesis statement. You want to supply supporting ideas, details, and arguments in your body paragraphs. And many writers choose to start with the body paragraphs. And this is because they know what they want to write about, or they at least have some ideas, but maybe they don't have their thesis in mind yet. They haven't refined a thesis statement yet. So many writers will write out all of the body paragraphs first. They'll get their ideas down on paper and develop a thesis statement from that, which works out perfectly because your body paragraphs are supposed to follow and support the thesis, and the thesis statement is supposed to encompass all of your body paragraphs. Each paragraph that is a body paragraph should express a single supporting idea. You shouldn't have multiple supporting ideas in one paragraph. Pick a main supporting idea and then give more details about that one. Back up that one single supporting idea within that body paragraph. Usually, you will find the supporting idea at the beginning of the paragraph. The writer will let you know right away what their supporting idea is that they're presenting in that body paragraph. Now, sometimes the writer will save it for the end of the paragraph as a dramatic gesture, or it might be in the second sentence if the first sentence was used as a transition between body paragraphs. But usually, you'll find your single supporting idea spelled out for you in the beginning of a paragraph. However, all sentences in the body paragraph should support both the main idea of that paragraph and the thesis statement of the essay as a whole. So whenever you're writing your body paragraphs, every sentence should still be supporting that main idea, that single supporting idea of the paragraph, and it should be backing up your thesis statement. Now, your thesis statement was supposed to be broad enough to encompass everything that you're going to write about, so your body paragraphs should be able to support your thesis statement without specifically restating it. And each body paragraph should not repeat the thesis statement. You don't want to repeat your thesis statement over and over throughout your paper. What you want to do is state your thesis statement in the introductory paragraph. All your body paragraphs should be supporting that thesis with details. And then in your conclusion, you don't want to repeat the thesis statement, but you want to echo it. You want to give your readers a final reminder of what it was that you were writing about, what your main idea was. So the thesis should simply be developed, expanded, and refined in the body paragraphs. The body paragraphs are simply there to be that. They're the body of the essay. They're the meat of it. That's where you're getting all your details from. The thesis tells you what you're going to be writing about. The body paragraph is where you're actually writing it. You're giving all those details. So most of your information is going to be found in your body paragraphs. So just remember, when you're drafting body paragraphs, get your supporting ideas in there, but stick to one single supporting idea per paragraph and make sure that every supporting idea is supporting that main thesis statement. Drafting conclusions. Many writers found the conclusion the most difficult part of the essay to compose because there's this expectation that it has to be profound or inspiring, something magical. But it doesn't have to be all that. It should avoid simply restating the thesis statement. You don't want to hear the same sentence again that you heard in your introductory paragraph. But it should suggest some ideas or questions that were raised by the preceding text. Maybe your conclusion brings up a different idea that could be elaborated on for a future essay, or a question that really makes the reader think about what they've just read. A good conclusion will remind the reader of the thesis, remind them of the thesis without restating it by providing some applications, questions, or possible counter-arguments. So the writer may tell you how you can use this information in the future. What application does it have for your life? They could pose an interesting question that makes you really think about what you just read, or a counter-argument. Perhaps they say, well, maybe I'm not really right after all. Maybe it's this way. And then that really throws you for a loop because you've just read their whole paper that supports their thesis, and now they're saying, well, maybe not. So that would really leave a lasting impression on you, I think, because you've just read this whole paper about one topic and they're telling you, oh, but maybe it's this way, which leaves you open to questioning it, thinking about it, and maybe you want to go do some research yourself after that. A good conclusion should indicate how the reader should think about this subject in the future. So maybe it doesn't change your mind about a particular issue completely, but whenever this issue comes up later, this essay should come to mind. You should think about, oh, I remember I read that one thing in that essay and it really struck home with me and I remember that now. Or, well, I didn't know about this before, but after reading this essay, I know about this one thing and it affects the way I feel about the issue. The conclusion should be memorable. So we talked about how it doesn't have to be super inspiring, but it should be memorable because it's the final impression that your reader is left with. It's the last thing they're going to read before they're done reading your composition. So you want it to be memorable. So here are 3 different ways that you might do that without making it some awe-inspiring work. Many writers save a fascinating detail, an anecdote or short story, or a quote for the end of their paper. So your conclusion could have some fascinating detail. Maybe you saved one thing that you found in your research that you thought was really cool and it supports your thesis statement really well, and you saved it for the conclusion because you want your reader to remember that detail. Or maybe you found a little story or thought up a little story that would support your thesis and you include that. Or maybe there's a famous quote out there. Hearing or reading a famous name makes you think, oh, they said something that supports their thesis. Ooh, let me read that and remember that. Let me think about that again. So these are 3 tricks that you can put in your bag for helping you compose a successful conclusion, one that will be memorable and leave a final impression on your reader. When you're drafting conclusions, don't stress about making it this magical, inspirational thing. You might succeed. You might get a magical, inspirational conclusion, but not all of them are going to be that flowery. They're not all going to work out that way. They may just support your thesis statement without restating it and let the reader know how they should think about this subject in the future. You want to leave a lasting impression, and 3 ways to do that would be with a fascinating detail, an anecdote, or a quote. So I would definitely remember these 3 tricks to keep in your bag.
The exclamation point is used to show strong emotion. It's important that writers only use the exclamation point sparingly, because if it's used too much, it loses its effect. So make sure it is only used when it is actually needed. So take a look at this sentence. Look at that sunrise. So basically here it depends on how the writer wants to convey this sentence. Or say this is a quotation, it depends on how the speaker said it. So if the speaker said, look at that sunrise, we would just put a period at the end. But if the speaker said, look at that sunrise, then we would put an exclamation point or an exclamation mark, as it is often called. Exclamation points can often be used after one word, like wow, look at that sunrise. So here the exclamation point is used twice because the speaker said it with lots of emotion. Now, if it's not a quotation, then it just depends on how you as the writer wants to convey a message. So if you want it to be very subtle, you just add a period to the end of the sentence. But if it's a strong point that you want to show the reader, then use an exclamation point to help that sentence stand out. But remember that many times an exclamation point is seen as being used to show that the speaker or the writer is yelling. So if you use lots of exclamation points, then the reader feels like the writer is always yelling at them. An exclamation point can often be used in place of a question mark. So, like, take a look at this sentence. What is going on? So here, generally, you would put a question mark because it's a question. But if the speaker said it like, what is going on, or the writer wants to convey that strong emotion, then you'd put an exclamation point in place of the question mark. So again, make sure that the exclamation point is used appropriately and not too often so that it does not lose its effect.
Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? Probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you 1,000,000 times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, that's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she or a girl to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as, it just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say this was this or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him or a man to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water. Those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl, but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading. Fragments and run-on sentences. A fragment is an incomplete sentence or thought that cannot stand on its own. And it can't stand on its own and is incomplete because it's missing either a noun or a verb. So let's look at some examples of fragments. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. Now this is a lot of information. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. But you have your noun, some adjectives to describe it, an article adjective, and then you've got a prepositional phrase that tells you where they are. But you're missing something. You're missing the verb. So this one is a fragment. So you can have a longer sentence or a longer fragment that looks like a sentence and still have it be a fragment because it's missing either the noun or the verb. So we had our noun, but we were missing our verb. So even though it looks long and looks like it could be a sentence, don't be fooled by the length of a fragment, because just because a phrase is long doesn't mean it's a complete sentence. Let's look at another example. Waited all day at my house for you. In this sentence, we have an action, waiting, so we've got our verb. All day at my house for you. Well, you see some pronouns in there, but there's no noun. There's no subject of this sentence, so you're missing a subject noun in this one. So it's still a fragment. You've got the verb part, you've got the predicate part of your sentence, but you don't have the subject part. So this is a fragment. It is not a complete sentence. So when you're looking for fragments, look for either a missing verb or missing noun, because if you're missing one of those, then your fragment cannot stand on its own and will not be a complete sentence. In your writing, you'll need to revise this, you need to revise these, and often you can just add a little bit to a fragment to make it a complete sentence. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard look so nice this time of year. Smell wonderful. Are going to win the contest. You can finish the sentence in any way. Waited all day at my house for you. You could say, we waited all day at my house for you. I waited. My mom and I waited. It's a little bit more limited what you could put at the beginning of this sentence because we've got my and you for pronouns down here, but you still have options and you could easily turn this fragment into a complete sentence. Now let's look at run-on sentences. A run-on sentence is a sentence that should be written as two sentences. It's too long. It contains too much information and is confusing to the reader. And if it's running on and on and on, then it's likely there's not correct punctuation and there's too many nouns and too many verbs crammed into one sentence. So you need to break it up so that you've got separate complete thoughts and it's easier for the reader to understand. Let's look at these examples of run-on sentences and then correct them. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. This is a lot of information, so we need to see where one thought ends and another one starts so that we can split it up. I couldn't believe it. Well, we want to know what she couldn't believe. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. So all that is one thought. So we're going to separate this and put a period, and we would need to capitalize the next letter, but since it was I, it was automatically capitalized. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. Now we have two complete sentences. They're separate, it's not too much information in each sentence, and it's not going to be confusing to the reader. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. So now, it's not so confusing. It doesn't just run on and on and on. We didn't have so many subjects and so many verbs in one sentence. Now we've separated it out and made it easier for the reader to understand right away. Let's look at our next example. John and Mary had so much fun they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. Now this one, we need to find where we need to split it up. We have another run-on sentence. We've got a lot of actions, but we need to see where we could split it up to keep the subject and verb of one sentence and the subject and verb of a second sentence and make it two complete sentences. We don't want to split it up incorrectly and leave a fragment somewhere. John and Mary. Let's look at what they did. John and Mary had so much fun, they. When we get to they, that's a new pronoun. That's a new subject. So we should stop there. John and Mary had so much fun. And then, if we're starting a new sentence, we need to capitalize our T in they. John and Mary had so much fun. They went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So now, we have two complete thoughts. First, we're saying they had fun, and then we're saying how they had fun. And we didn't keep it a run-on sentence to where we had this pronoun in the middle of this sentence, making it sound a little confusing. We have John and Mary having fun, and then they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So we split it up into two sentences that are easier to understand. And you also would want to revise any run-on sentences in your writing. If you see a sentence that's going on and on for 3 or 4 lines, you probably need to find somewhere in there to break it up so that it isn't a run-on sentence. You can have sentences that are more complex if you're using semicolons, etc., but you don't want it to be so long that there are too many ideas in one sentence. So when you're writing, make sure you don't have any incomplete thoughts that are missing a noun or verb. We don't want any fragments in your writing, and make sure that none of your sentences are going on so long and including too much information that it makes it a run-on sentence. Gerund, infinitive, and participle. These are all different forms of verbs. A gerund is a verb ending in ing that is used as a noun in a sentence. There are a lot of times when you'll see a noun that is actually a verb form. We admired the vocalist singing. In this sentence, they were admiring the vocalist singing. They were admiring something, which makes this a noun. But singing is also a verb, so this is a gerund because it is a verb used as a noun in this sentence. Running is my favorite hobby. Running is also a verb, but in this sentence, running is the noun. This is my favorite hobby, this thing. So running is a gerund in this sentence. Infinitive is a singular verb preceded by the word to, which is considered the base or unconjugated form of the word. So, let's look at some examples. She loves to sing. So this is the infinitive form of the verb sing. It isn't conjugated, it hasn't been changed to past tense, it hasn't had a suffix added to it yet. It's got the word to in front of it, so it is an infinitive. She loves to sing. I love to run. So if you see a verb that has the word to in front of it, it's a good chance that that's in the infinitive form of that verb. And participles are verbs that end in ing, like gerunds, and form the progressive tense of the verb. But participles are not used as nouns, so that's the difference between the gerund and the participle. A gerund is going to be used as a noun in this sentence. A participle is not. The sleeping baby is snoring. Sleeping is a participle. It has the ing ending, and it's used in the sentence that lets you know the baby is sleeping, but it doesn't say the baby is sleeping. The running motor sounds loud. Running is also a verb, but in this sentence it's got the ing and it isn't used as a verb. The running motor, it lets you know the motor is running, but it doesn't say the motor is running. The verb in this sentence is sounds. So running and sleeping act more as adjectives in this sentence. And not all participles are going to act as adjectives, but they are going to end in ing, and they're going to tell you what's going on with the noun in the sentence without actually behaving as the verb in that sentence. So whenever you're reading and you're trying to figure out parts of speech in certain sentences, look to see if you see gerunds, infinitives, or participles. Because if you know a word is a gerund, then you'll say, oh, I know this word is a verb that's used as a noun. Or if you see a noun being used as a verb, you can say, oh, this is a gerund. So knowing those things can help you finish diagramming the rest of the sentence. If you know that one word, even though it looks like a verb, is a noun, then you will be able to find your actual verb, such as is, which is a be verb and may not be as easy to identify since it isn't an action verb. So don't be confused by the fact that running is an action and is just this little be verb. Infinitives, make sure that you're watching for that clue word to. If you see to before a verb, then you're probably looking at the infinitive form. And participles, look for the ing ending where the verb is not being used as a verb in that sentence. It's being used as an adjective or some other word, and you actually have a different verb. And it's going to end in ing but not behave as a noun. So in diagramming sentences, it's going to be important that you can tell the difference between a noun and a verb and an adjective. And sometimes verbs look like other things. Even though it's going to look like a verb, it's going to behave like a noun or going to behave like an adjective. So just pay close attention because verbs are not always going to behave like verbs.
There are certain words and titles that need to be italicized. When typing, these words would be in italics, but when writing it out by hand, these words just need to be underlined because it is too difficult to write words in italics by hand. So here are the words and titles that need to be italicized or underlined. The titles of books, the titles of poems, long poems, the ones that could be a book by themselves, speeches, particularly famous speeches, the titles of movies, the titles of TV shows, plays, long musical pieces, and magazines. Space shuttles, planes, and ships, like the name of a space shuttle, the name of a plane, or the name of a ship, all need to be in italics or underlined if written by hand. Some words need to be in italics if you want to place particular emphasis on that word. Like if someone was saying, come here, they could underline that word or put it in italics. If a word is expressed as a word in a sentence, then it needs to be put in italics. Like if you spell basically wrong, the writer is not using the word basically to express anything in the sentence. They are actually talking about the word basically. So that's why it's underlined. Also, there are many foreign words that are part of the English language almost because they're used so frequently. But any foreign words or phrases that are not very familiar in the English language need to be underlined or placed in italics. Like in this case, edificio needs to be underlined. So those are the important things to remember when it comes to putting words in italics.
Italics and ellipses. Italics sets apart a word or phrase from surrounding words. It distinguishes a word or phrase. It's used for book titles, foreign words, names of vehicles, used for emphasis, and for words of words. And it's used for words only, not for punctuation. So if you have a phrase or a name of something in italics and it's at the end of the sentence, the words get italicized, but the period or exclamation point or question mark at the end of the sentence does not get italicized. So let's look at some examples to see how italics can distinguish a word in a sentence and set it apart from the rest of the sentence so that you really focus on that one word. I loved Black Beauty when I was 11. Black Beauty is the title of a book, and it sets it apart, and you know that's what the title is because it's in italics and the rest of the sentence isn't. So you can easily distinguish what the title is from what else I wrote. I just got a feeling of deja vu, that feeling that something's happening that's already happened before. Deja vu is a foreign word or foreign phrase, and so it is put in italics to set it apart from the rest of the sentence. The Titanic. The Titanic is the name of a vehicle. This could be cars, it could be ships, it could be planes. Any vehicle, the name of it is going to get italicized. So Titanic gets italicized. He ate not 2, but 10 slices of pizza. 10 being italicized gives emphasis to the word. You notice how when I read it, I emphasized the word 10. He ate not 2, but 10 slices of pizza. You're emphasizing just how great the number of slices of pizza was that he ate. And lastly, italics can be used to set off words of words. I love the word italics. So whenever you're saying, let's look at the word italics, or whenever writing the words through and through, T-H-R-O-U-G-H and T-H-R-E-W, you would want to make sure you were using them correctly in the sentence. Whenever you're talking about a word and you say the word or look at this word, then you want to italicize the word you're talking about. And these would be English words because you're already italicizing foreign words. So it's English words that are words of words. That's what that means. So when you see italics, pay special attention to them and see why those words are being italicized. Is it a book title, a foreign word, the name of a vehicle, or is the author trying to emphasize something specific? Or are they just pointing out a specific word that they like or wanting you to pay attention to a certain word that they're discussing? Next, we're going to talk about ellipses, which are 3 dots, just a little dot, 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 used in formal writing to show that words are missing. And a lot of times this is used to leave out part of a long quote. But if you're doing that when you're writing, if you're leaving out part of a long quote, be sure not to change meaning. If you leave out too much of the quote or you leave out an important part, then the meaning is not preserved. So you want to make sure that you're preserving the meaning of a quote or the meaning of a passage whenever you are inserting an ellipsis. So let's look at this example. This is a quote from Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. I cannot help it. Reason has nothing to do with it. I love her against reason. Well, that's a longer quote, and if you're trying to make it fit in your paper and your paper can only be 500 words, then you could insert an ellipsis. Ellipsis is singular, ellipses is plural. So if we insert an ellipsis, you could just say, I cannot help it. I love her against reason. Saying reason has nothing to do with it is kind of repetitive because you're already saying, I love her against reason. I can't help it. So putting the ellipsis here takes the place of this phrase. It lets you know, or lets the reader know, that there were more words here in this quote, but you took them out because they didn't affect the meaning. So you still get the gist of what the quote was about without having extra words in there. So you cut out 7 words with just 3 little dots. So it can be very handy when using quotes in a paper. So in your writing, pay attention to what words are italicized, see what the author is trying to tell you with those italics, and pay attention to ellipses, what was left out. Make sure that if you are using ellipses in your paper, you do not take away the meaning of the quote.
A comma is there for the purpose of breaking the flow of text. So basically we could define the job of commas as to break the flow of text. So commas should come in places in sentences where we would naturally pause if we were speaking that sentence. And so one way to test whether or not a comma is necessary is to pause very deliberately at each comma when reading. Because it's important not to overuse commas because they lose their effect if they're used in places that they should not be. So it's important to know when commas are needed and when they're not needed, both for your own writing and maybe if you're revising someone else's work. So let's practice. Right here we have a sentence that says, as you can see, the car is very old. But we have a comma right here. So if you're just reading this to yourself inside your head, you may have trouble determining whether or not the comma is needed. So try reading it out loud and deliberately stopping at the comma. As you can see, the car is very old. Well, that makes sense because if you were speaking this, you would be explaining to someone and you would say, as you can see, the car is very old. So the comma there is needed. Another example is this sentence right here. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So here we have 3 commas. We actually have 4 commas. And so 2 of these commas are there for the purpose of setting off this phrase, and the other 2 commas are there because we're making a list. So first, let's take a look at the phrase. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So really, we could omit everything in between these 2 commas and just say natural disasters are not very common here. So that's why we're using commas here, because we could set this off. But if you were speaking this, you would say natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So both of those commas are needed. Now, when you're reading the list, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, you don't really need to pause in between each item in the list. But here, the commas aren't here as much to break the flow of text. In this case, they're just distinguishing between the different items in the list. So this is kind of an exception of when you wouldn't follow the rules of commas are only there to break the flow of text. But in general, hopefully you can see kind of a better idea of when to use commas. So where the check marks are, those were all the correct places to use commas, and then right there and right there as well. You just want to make sure that you use commas when you need them, and if in doubt, then generally leave the comma. But many times you want to leave out commas when you can because they slow down your writing, because someone feels like they need to mentally pause. If they're speaking, they need to actually pause when reading that comma. And so make sure your comma usage is appropriate. Misplaced modifiers can be very confusing, and they can distort the accurate meaning of your sentence. So let's look at this example up here on the board. The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you in class. This is a case of a misplaced modifier. Now, another word for an adverb is a modifier. So I'm going to write up here on the board, adverb equals modifier. Modifier is the same thing as an adverb. So when we're saying a misplaced modifier, we're actually saying misplaced adverb. Okay, so you're looking at this sentence thinking, where is the adverb? In class, collectively, is the adverb. This is what you call an adverbial phrase. It's a group of words that collectively takes the form of an adverb, or collectively does the job of an adverb. So adverbs often answer a question. In this case, the question is, where? The teacher said that eating fruit is good for you. Where did the teacher say that? They said, in class. So in class answers the question where. So it's an adverbial phrase. Now, the reason this is misplaced, this is a misplaced adverbial phrase, is because it appears to the reader that this phrase is modifying eating fruit is good for you. So it appears to the reader that the teacher is saying that to eat fruit in class is good. So it looks like the teacher is in favor of the students eating fruit while in the classroom. Now, that's not actually the case. The teacher is merely saying that eating fruit is good for you, but not while you were in class. So the better way to write this sentence would be, the teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So in this case, in class is still the adverb, still the adverbial phrase, but since it's closer to what it's modifying, it makes more sense. So whenever you are writing, make sure that you put the adverb or the adverb clause or the adverbial phrase, whatever word or group of words that's modifying something in a sentence. Make sure that the modifier is very close to what it is modifying. Make sure the modifier is close to the modified. So right here, in class is the modifier, but it's modifying the teacher said, or it's modifying the verb said. But look how far away it is from the verb said. All these words are in between it and the word it's modifying. But when you put the adverb right next to the word that it's modifying, it makes it so much simpler for the reader to understand. Now the sentence can be read correctly and understood correctly. The teacher said in class that eating fruit is good for you. So remember, when you're writing, make sure that you don't misplace the modifier. Nouns can play different roles in different sentences. They can play the role of the subject of a sentence. They can take a possessive form, or they can play the role of an object in a sentence. So I want to look at those three different examples, three example sentences written up here on the board. Take a look at this first sentence. John has wisdom. So what's the subject in this sentence? The subject is John. And the verb is has. So right here, John is the subject of the sentence. Well, John is also a noun because a noun names a person, place, or thing. So John is obviously a person, and this is actually what we would call a proper noun because it names a specific person. So right here, John is a noun, and it's playing the role of a subject. So you can see here how a noun can play the role of a subject. Now look at this next sentence. John's wisdom can be helpful. What's the subject here? You may be tempted to say John's, but the subject is actually wisdom. So if the subject is wisdom, then what role is John's playing? Well, John's is the possessive form of John. It's describing the wisdom. It's saying that the wisdom belongs to John because it's John's wisdom. So here you see John's playing a possessive role in the sentence. Now look at this third sentence. The company hired John. Well, the subject of this sentence is company, and the verb is hired. So what role is John playing in this sentence? If it's not the subject and it's not in possessive form, so what role is it playing? Well, we would call John right here the object of the sentence. The object is what the subject of the sentence is acting on. So the company hired someone. Who did the company hire? The company hired John. The company is acting upon John. So that's how you find the object of a sentence. Now you notice that in this first sentence and in this third sentence, John is in the same form, just John. But when it plays the role of a possessive, then John has apostrophe S to it. So when a noun is playing the role of a subject and when a noun is playing the role of an object, it's going to look the same. But when it's in possessive form, you're going to have to change the word a little bit. Generally, you can just add apostrophe S, but there are some more complex rules when it comes to making some nouns possessive. So the important thing to remember, the thing you need to take away from this session, is that nouns can play three different roles. They can be the subject of a sentence, they can be in possessive form, or they can be the object of a sentence.
Organizational methods to structure text. Authors organize their writing based on the purpose of their text. And 5 of the main methods that authors use to structure their text are cause and effect, compare and contrast, chronological order, inductive presentation of ideas, and deductive presentation ideas. Cause and effect presents the reasons something happened. For instance, if I said, if you go to bed late, you will be tired. The cause is going to bed late, and the effect is being tired. And a cause and effect piece of writing is going to keep giving you reason something happened and the effect of that particular reason. Compare and contrast writing discusses similarities and differences. It's going to say how two things are alike and how they are different. And these may also come across as pro and con pieces, where it gives you the pros of two things and the cons of two things. An example would be if I said as a thesis statement, those who are up to date on technology are still debating over whether DVDs or Blu-ray discs are better. Well, the author could go through and describe all the similarities between DVDs and Blu-ray discs and all the differences between DVDs and Blu-ray discs. So, in the end, you could make up your mind which one is better because they're simply comparing and contrasting the two. Chronological order presents information in the order that it happened. It starts at the beginning and works its way to the end. And a good example of chronological order pieces are biographies. You start whenever someone was born, you go through their childhood, adulthood, and events leading up to their death. It happens, the book is laid out to describe events exactly in the order that they happened chronologically in time. Inductive presentation of ideas starts with specific examples and moves to a general conclusion. So if I were to want to convince you that it was good to donate blood, I would start off with lots of specific examples or reasons why it was good to donate blood, and then give you the general conclusion, you should always donate blood. Deductive presentation of ideas is going to be the opposite of that. It starts with the conclusion, you should always donate blood. And then it explains supporting examples. So I would give you examples or reasons that list out the benefits of donating blood. And you can see these two are opposite, so it's important to remember the difference. Inductive is going to list all of them and then take them in a general conclusion at the end. Deductive is kind of, maybe think division. You start with one big conclusion and divide it down into lots of supporting details or examples. So whenever you are trying to organize your own writing or trying to figure out the purpose of an author's writing, try to figure out what the organizational method was, and it might help you figure out the overall purpose of the text.
Organization is very important in a paper because it helps the reader follow the writer's train of thought. So there's several types of organization, and some of those I've written up here on the board. The important thing is that the writer picks a method of organization and sticks with it through the entire paper. So the first method of organization is spatial organization. So say I was describing a room. I would describe everything on the floor, then everything on one wall, and moving clockwise, describe each wall, and then describe the ceiling. I wouldn't describe the couch, and then a painting on one wall, and then a picture on another wall, and then discuss the recliner on the floor. I would focus on one area of the room before moving on to the next area. Another way to organize a paper is through cause and effect. You could talk about something that's going on and the effect of that, or talk about several causes and several effects. You can also compare and contrast. If you're talking about two or more things, talk about how these things are alike and how these things are different. Another way is through chronological order. So you could talk about the series of events. This is great if it's step-by-step instructions. You wouldn't start with something and start talking about it and then say, oh, before you do this, make sure you do this. You would start at the very beginning. Like you were talking about a recipe, you would talk about this is the first ingredient, then the second ingredient, then the third ingredient. So that can be very good. Or if you're talking about someone's life, you would start when they were born and move all the way till where they are currently or until death. If you're talking about a series of events, it's best to give the background information first and work up to today. So chronological order can be a great method of organization. Classification and division. This is like talking about things that are very general and then getting more specific. And then problem and solution. You can talk about a problem and then the solution to that problem or some possible solutions to that problem. So these are just some basic ways to organize a paper. There are other methods out there, and there's some that you can kind of come up with on your own. You wouldn't have to find them. You just naturally know this is the best way to organize my paper. But the important thing is Find one way to organize your paper and stick with it. Don't jump around between the different methods of organization.
Persuasive techniques. When an author is writing, they can use a number of persuasive techniques to convince you to feel a certain way or do something or buy something. Here are some examples. Glittering generalities are words that sound great but do not convey much actual meaning. These could be words like good, fair, honest, happy. They sound good and they pull on a reader or listener's emotions and make you feel a certain way, even if there's not any evidence or support for there to actually substantiate that feeling. But those words are buzzwords that make you feel a certain way or have positive connotations, so they are considered glittering generalities. Next, we have logical fallacies. These use common errors in reasoning to persuade. Two different kinds of logical fallacies are the slippery slope and hasty generalization. The slippery slope says if one thing happens, then another thing must follow. For instance, let's talk about some shampoo. If I use a little bit of shampoo and my hair gets clean, I could use a lot of shampoo and my hair would get even cleaner. Well, we know that's not true. If I used a whole bottle of shampoo, my hair isn't going to get any cleaner than if I used the required amount. So that is what an example of slippery slope would be. A hasty generalization is just what it sounds like. You come to a conclusion too fast. Let me tell you about this new product I got. It is so great. I've only had it a day, but I know it's going to change my life forever. Well, you made that generalization very quickly. You decided it was going to change your life after one day, but you don't know how you're going to feel about it in a week, in a month. So it may be something that you stop using after just a couple of days, but that first day you were making a hasty generalization, which was a logical fallacy based on what you knew after one day. Another persuasive technique is the bandwagon appeal, which appeals to a person's need to belong. This is the one where people will say, everyone's doing it, you should too. So if they said, oh, everyone's seen this movie, everyone's going to the movie to see, or going to the theater to see this new movie, that means you should too. Everyone's shopping at this store, you should too. Everyone's getting this certain kind of car, you should get that too because everyone else is doing it. It appeals to your need to belong. The next one is snob appeal, which appeals to a person's need to feel superior. So this one might be, get it before your friends do. It could be the next new phone or tickets to a concert, but you have a need to feel superior, and so the snob appeal is what an author can use. They can say, get it before everyone else. You want to be the best in school, you should have this. If you want to be the coolest, you need to come shop here. You want to be better than your peers. And that is what snob appeal is. Appeal to fear is going to make a person feel like they'll be either unsafe or their health is in danger if they don't do something. So an appeal to fear might be with an alarm system. Someone might say, get this alarm system so your family will be safe. No one's going to break into your house under our watch. So then you feel safe. You feel like your family is safe. No one's going to be able to break into your house. If they do, the cops will be there in an instant to protect you. And while all of that may not be true, that's what the alarm system is trying to tell you with their advertisement and their appeal to fear. Another example that I see a lot lately is with distracted driving campaigns. And while I think that it's great to try to discourage distracted driving, they are using an appeal to fear in a lot of the things that I've seen. For instance, when you are driving in a car and you need to make a phone call or someone texts, you have that urge to reach and read it. And you shouldn't do that. It's very unsafe. So many accidents happen because people are driving distractedly. So the distracted driving campaigns that are out right now show very graphic car wrecks. They show the very terrible things that could happen if you are driving and you are distracted. People get hurt, people die. You could kill your friends or family members that are in the car with you if you were driving distractedly. So that's appealing to fear. Your safety is in danger. Your family safety or friend safety is in danger. Next we have an appeal to pity. And this one will be where you see your starving orphans and they're trying to get you to donate money to Africa or different charities, or your abandoned pets, where people are trying to get you to adopt pets or donate to the Humane Society. It's appealing to people's sense of pity, their emotional well-being. They're thinking, oh, look at these poor things, it's tugging on my heartstrings. I need to go and donate money. I need to go adopt one of these pets because they look so sad. It's an appeal to pity. And last we have either or fallacies. This tells you there is this choice or that choice. Nothing else, nothing in the middle, no middle ground, nothing in the middle there that we could compromise with. An example would be if I told you, you can choose to be a doctor or a plumber. Nothing else. Well, you'll tell me that's not true. I could be a teacher or a nurse or a writer. I don't have to just be a doctor or a plumber. I can do whatever I want to do. And that's true. But an either or fallacy is going to present two options as if those are the only two options. Now there are lots more persuasive techniques, but these are going to be some of the most common ones you'll see. So if you feel like you're reading a persuasive text, look and see how many of these techniques you can find. Prefixes, suffixes, and root words. Have you ever been reading a book and come across a word that you've never seen before? Well, if you can break that word down into prefixes, suffixes, and root words, then you can probably figure out what the word means. For instance, orthography may be a word you've never seen before. But if we break it down into its prefix, ortho, its root word, graph, and its suffix, y, then we might be able to figure out what the word means. Ortho means correct or straight. Graph means write or draw. And Y means the state or condition of. So if we put all those together, we can get the state of being written correctly. And when we compare the definition we came up with our actual definition, you can see they're pretty close. The state of being written correctly, writing words using the proper letters. So you got a pretty good idea just by breaking the words down into a prefix, a root word, and a suffix and figuring out what those meant. And even if you only knew graph had something to do with writing, you would have an idea that orthography had to do something with writing. Let's look at another example. Geometric. We'll break down into our prefix, geo, our root word, metra, and our suffix, ic. Geo means earth, and we put that with metra, which means measure, and ic means having to do with. So if we put all of those together, we can come up with having to do with measuring the earth. Now this one isn't quite as close to the actual definition, relating to the branch of mathematics that has to do with measuring points, lines, and angles, but it does have measuring in there. You would be able to tell from the root word measure that geometric is going to have something to do with measuring. So if you ever come across a word that you don't know, First, try to figure out what the prefix is, the root word is, and the suffix is, so that you can maybe get an idea of what the word means. You can see how important prefixes, suffixes, and root words are to understanding what a word means.
There's something I like to call preposition overload, and that's when a writer or a speaker uses more prepositions than needed. Take a look at this first example. Where is Jim at? You notice right here that at is a preposition. However, this preposition actually is not needed. You don't believe me? Here, look, we can draw a line through at and try reading the sentence without the preposition. Where is Jim? See, the sentence still makes perfect sense without the preposition. Take a look at this next sentence. Where did Jim go to? We can again draw a line through that preposition right there, to, and try reading the sentence without to. Where did Jim go? So a good way of determining whether a preposition in a sentence is needed or not is just by crossing out the preposition or reading the sentence without the preposition and seeing if the preposition still sounds grammatically correct. Take a look at this last example. It's not quite as obvious. He lives outside of the city. That sentence may sound perfectly fine, but actually try saying the sentence without the word of. He lives outside the city. The sentence still makes sense without this preposition. So again, even though this isn't very obvious, this is still a case of preposition overload. And as a writer, you don't want to use words that are not needed, because when you use more words than needed, it hinders the clarity of your writing. A question mark is used at the end of any sentence that is a question. So like in this sentence, it says, where are we? This is a question, so there's a question mark at the end of the sentence. Question marks are also used in quotations that ask a question. So right here it says, is dinner at 6 p.m.? So there's a question mark at the end of the quotation because the speaker is asking a question. Notice though that there's not a question mark at the end of the sentence. There's just a period. That's because the writer of this sentence is not asking a question. Is dinner at 6 p.m., he asks, is not a question. But is dinner at 6 p.m.? Well, that is a question. So that's why the question mark only applies to the words inside the quotation marks. Also notice right here that 6 p.m. ends with a period because it's an abbreviation. Even though there's a period right here, you still use a question mark right next to the period. You probably noticed that in quotations that declare something, you just put a comma at the end. So if this was a declarative sentence, we would just leave it as a period. But since it's asking a question, we use a quotation mark. Now, this next sentence is an example of when not to use a question mark. It says, the officer asked why I was speeding. This is what we call an indirect question, because although this sentence is talking about a time that someone was asked a question, this sentence right here is not a question. So a period is just used. This sentence says, we will leave at 7 p.m., won't we? So we will leave at 7 p.m. is a declarative sentence, so it would just end in a period. But since won't we is added to the end, it becomes a question. So that's why we need a question mark at the end. This final sentence says, will everyone please give their full attention to the speaker? So notice that this sentence ends in a period, even though this sentence technically is a question, because the speaker of this sentence is saying, please give your attention to the speaker. However, this is more of a formal request. The speaker of this sentence is not saying, is not asking for a response. They're not saying, will you please be quiet? And people are going to say, yes, we will be quiet. It's more of a formal way of saying, be quiet because the speaker is talking. So in formal requests, especially long formal requests, a period is used at the end of the sentence instead of a question mark. So the important thing to remember is that question marks are just used at the end of any sentence that is a question. Quotation marks are used to show that the words inside the quotation marks are someone else's, not the writer's own. So look at this sentence. Come over here, Joe said. So the quotation marks right here and right here are conveying that the writer did not say come over here. Joe said come over here. So notice a few things about a sentence that has a quote in it. First, you open up the sentence with quotation marks. Then you capitalize the first letter of the first word inside the quotation marks. And then if you have a sentence that is declarative or imperative, any sentence that would end with a period, if it was on its own, you end that sentence with a comma, then you have quotation marks, and then you say the rest of the sentence. So this sentence says, where did he go? Notice we open up with quotation marks, capitalize the W, but if where did he go stood by itself, it would have a question mark because it's a question. So we put a question mark right here and then close with the quotation marks. Notice that the question mark is included inside the quotation marks. It's not on the outside, it's on the inside. This sentence says, there he is, he exclaimed. So in this case, the person's saying it with a lot of emotion, so that's why we ended with an exclamation mark. Now these next couple sentences are kind of inverted from the sentences we've been looking at because the quote comes later in the sentence. So this sentence says, Michael said, I can't wait for dinner. So you put a comma after said, open up with quotation marks, go through the sentence, and then this sentence right here is declarative, so it ends with a period. And up here we ended with a comma, but here we're ending with a period because we've come to the end of the sentence, and there needs to be some kind of period or question mark or exclamation mark to end out the sentence. So in this case, a period is chosen to end the sentence, and then quotation marks are put at the end. Notice that the period is inside the quotation marks. This sentence says, Michael asked, what's for dinner? In this case, it's a question, so that's why we have a question mark at the end. Again, notice that it's inside the quotation marks. Now this final sentence is kind of unique. It says, I think we are having burgers, Michael said. Do you know what we are having? So right here, there's two quotes within one sentence. So it says, I think we are having burgers. So we open up with quotation marks. We have the quote right here. We end with a comma because this is a declarative sentence. Then we have another set of quotation marks. Then we have something outside of the quotes because we're saying that Michael said this. And then we continue on with what Michael said. So we open up with quotation marks. And it says, do you know what we are having? This is a question, so we use a question mark. And then we end with quotation marks. So those are the important things you need to remember when using quotation marks.
Rhetorical schemes. Authors use rhetorical schemes to emphasize, draw angles, and engage the reader. Some common rhetorical schemes we have are parallelism, repetition, and antithesis. Now, rhetorical schemes are just devices used to make your writing stronger and more interesting. So these are just a few of many different rhetorical schemes, and if you were interested in more ideas, you could always research and find other rhetorical schemes so that you could make your writing stronger. Parallelism is when several sentences are given the same grammatical structure. An example would be, Hector went to the store, he went to the bank, he went to the gym. The author suggests the dullness of these activities. That parallel structure shows that it's the same thing happening over and over again. It's really dull, it's really boring. He went to the store, he went to the bank, he went to the gym. He was just playing out the monotony of his day. It was dull, and this grammatical structure is supposed to echo the dullness of the story that's being told. Repetition is another example of a rhetorical scheme. Repetition is when you use the same word several times quickly, and the author does this for different reasons. Let's look at an example and then we'll discuss those reasons. They called him a slave. He thought of himself as a slave, and his prospects were no better than those of a slave. This mimics the plodding, hopeless nature of slavery. Think about the way that sounds. It sounds like he's plodding along. They called him a slave, and he thought of himself as a slave, and his prospects were no better than those of a slave. So it's plodding, and the sentence sounds hopeless, and you hear the word slave over and over again. And it causes the reader to focus on that word, slave, and consider whether it is really appropriate. So those are two reasons that a writer may use repetition. It may mimic a certain nature and make you think about that, or it could cause the reader to focus on that word and consider whether it's appropriate or whether it's being used as a literary device. Is this person really a slave, or is it someone that they're just calling a slave as an exaggeration because of the way he's being treated or the way that he's perceived? And we really don't know, based on this one sentence, whether this word is appropriate or not. We would have to see the rest of the paragraph. But it definitely does give us a plodding, hopeless feeling to this sentence. The last rhetorical scheme we're going to discuss is the antithesis, which is using contrary ideas expressed in a balanced sentence. An example would be, one small step for man, one giant leap for all mankind. This is the famous quote. It said after we took our first step on the moon, putting man on the moon was a giant leap for all mankind. But it was just one small step. He took one small step onto the moon, and that one small step counted as a giant leap for all mankind. So you've got those contrary ideas of a small step and a giant leap expressed in a balanced sentence. And you understand what he means. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Being able to step foot on the moon was a huge leap for mankind, even if it was just a small step literally. So this is an example of antithesis. So in your writing, there are several rhetorical schemes that you can use to make your writing stronger and more engaging to the reader.
There are a couple of uses for the slash. So there is a forward slash and a backslash. But we're not worried about the backslash here. We're concerned about the forward slash. There's a couple of uses for the forward slash that I want to take a look at. I have some examples written up here on the board. This first one says, bring your notebook and or spiral. So notice there's a forward slash between and or. That's because the writer doesn't know which one will apply to the reader. So say the reader has a notebook and they also have a spiral, then the word and is more appropriate to the reader, the notebook and the spiral. But say there's another reader that just has a notebook or they just have a spiral, then the word or is more appropriate here because it would say bring your notebook or your spiral. So the writer is just putting and or in there because it just depends on the reader in that case. And so the writer is showing that either one is acceptable. It's acceptable if someone just brings a notebook or if someone just brings a spiral. And it's also acceptable if someone brings a notebook and a spiral. Forward slashes can also be used to separate the lines of a poem. Now this can only be used for short poems like, not poems that can make up a whole book, just short poems. And you put a forward slash in there to show that these are two different lines of a poem. So in a poem you would have one line here, the air is filled with mist, and the next line would say, but I must insist. But in this case, we're just writing it in one line. So there's a forward slash to differentiate between the two lines of the poem. So that's a couple of uses for the forward slash. It's not that common in writing, so be hesitant when you use it and use it sparingly. Authors use language and word choice to convey a certain style, tone, and mood in a piece of literature. So style, tone, and mood are all different, but they're somewhat similar. They have to do with the way the author writes, the words they use, and the way they grammatically structure their pieces of writing. So first we're going to take a look at style, but notice it has 2 bullet points because the purpose of style is twofold. So one purpose of style is to be appropriate to the purpose of the text. So if there's a piece of writing that's really serious, then the style of writing is going to be very serious. It's going to use serious words in a serious, straightforward grammatical structure. But if it's meant to be comical, the piece of writing is meant to be comical, then the writing is going to be more relaxed and the grammatical structure is going to be more relaxed. And the second purpose of style is basically a way to set an author apart. It's a way to set authors apart. Every author is going to have their own particular style. It's going to be certain tendencies they have in their writing. Maybe they use a certain word a lot, or they structure a lot of their sentences the same way, or they develop the plot the same way in most of their stories. Well, that sets each author apart. And many times authors want their writing to set them apart from other writers. And sometimes this style is so strong that you could read a piece of writing and not know who wrote it, but guess who wrote it because of the style. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about is tone, which is the author's attitude toward the subject. And so basically, this is the author's attitude towards whatever the author is writing about. And so many times you can tell through the writing whether the author is for or against something. So sometimes an author might write something that's like a persuasive essay. And in that case, it's going to be very obvious what their attitude towards the subject at hand is because they're trying to persuade you one way or the other. But sometimes an author just writes an informative text. But you can still often tell what their tone is because whether they're trying to or not, many times they'll word things certain ways that can tell you how they feel about something. And so that's the tone. Now the mood is like the tone, but it's for the reader. And so basically it's the feeling the work invokes in the reader. So here we talked about the author's attitude towards the subject. We could define mood as the reader's attitude towards the subject. It's how the piece of writing makes the reader feel after reading it. So you can see how style, tone, and mood are similar in that they all pertain to the word choice and the particular language that is used. But they're also different because style pertains to the purpose of the text, and then the tone is concerned with the author's attitude towards the subject, and the mood is concerned with the reader's attitude towards the subject, or basically the way the piece of writing makes the reader feel. A subject, along with a verb, completes a sentence. Every sentence must have a subject and a verb. So always be looking for the subject in a sentence because it has to be there somewhere. Look at this first example. Running is good for you. The verb right here is. So then what is the subject of this sentence? Well, the way you can find the subject is it's the person or thing that's doing the action in the sentence. So what is in this sentence? Running is. So running would be the subject. Okay, so think of another example, like he rode his bike. Okay, rode is the verb here. So again, you can just ask the question, who is riding here? Who is the person or the thing doing the action here? Well, the action is riding, so then who is riding? He is riding, so he would be the subject. Over here, she is cheerful. Okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful, so she would be the subject. Now this is going to get a little bit more complicated now. She is cheerful, but her friend looks sad. So right here you see a verb, and then, okay, who is cheerful? She is cheerful. She is the one doing the action in the sentence, and that's being cheerful. So she is the subject. Now you look down here and you see another verb, looks. So what's the subject over here? Can there be two subjects in a sentence? There can. Because notice right here, but. But is what we call a conjunction because it joins two clauses together. So we have a sentence here and a sentence here, and but is joining them together to make them one. But if we have a sentence here and a sentence here being joined together by but, that means we must have two subjects and two verbs. So we found one subject and one verb, and then we found the other verb, so we're still looking for a subject. So what could the subject be? Could it be her looks sad? That wouldn't make sense, because remember, the subject is who or what is doing the action. So someone is looking sad in this sentence. Who is looking sad? The friend is looking sad, so friend is the subject over here. All right, like I said, every sentence has a subject and a verb, but you may come across some sentences like this. This sentence says, go to your room. So the verb here is go. So where is the subject in this sentence? Well, the subject is what we call an understood you. So we're going to put you in parentheses right there. So I say it's an understood you. Basically, it's understood that you is the subject of this sentence, so it doesn't even need to be included. So we could actually read the sentence as, you go to your room. But we don't always speak like that. Sometimes we leave the you out of the sentence, so we just have a verb. But nevertheless, there still is a subject. It's just not included in the sentence. Subject-verb agreement is essential to making sure that your writing makes sense. So let's look at some examples up here on the board so that you can better understand how to make your subject and your verb agree. See, the main problem that happens when subjects and verbs don't agree is that there's a certain number in the subject, but the verb doesn't agree with that number in the subject. See what I mean here? The flies are everywhere. See, flies is plural, and are is a plural verb as well. So that's why the subject and verb here are going together. So that's a great example of good subject-verb agreement. Now this sentence is talking about one fly. It says the fly is over here. So since fly is singular, the verb needs to be singular. Is a singular verb, so that's why it's used here. See, if we said the fly are over here, that wouldn't make sense. That's why we say the fly is over here. This next sentence says everything is in place. Words like everything or anyone are words that aren't very specific. So for the cases of subject-verb agreement, we consider words that aren't specific as being singular. So even though everything refers to many things, we still treat it as singular, so we use the singular verb is. This next sentence says people are here. So people is plural. That's talking about more than one person. So the verb needs to be plural as well. That's why we use the verb are. There are some sentences where you're going to have two subjects, and one subject may be plural and one subject may be singular. So the question arises, do I use a singular or plural verb? Well, the answer to that question is choose the verb or choose the word that is closest to the verb. So here we say my grandfather or my parents are going to buy a bike for me. So we would say are, because my parents is closest to are, and parents is plural, so we use the plural verb are. See, my grandfather is also a subject in this sentence. Grandfather and parents are both subjects. But grandfather is singular, so it doesn't necessarily agree with this plural verb. However, we have to choose either a singular verb or a plural verb, so it makes the most sense to base the verb off of the subject closest to it. So this sentence is the same sentence up here, just reversed. My parents or my grandfather is going to buy a bike for me. So here, we use the singular form of this verb, is, because grandfather is closest to the verb, and grandfather is singular. Parents, again, is still plural, but it's farther away from the verb than grandfather is. So the important thing is make sure your subject and verb agree in the number they are referring to, and that'll help you make your writing easier to understand on the reader's part. Subordinating conjunctions are words or group of words that make one part of the sentence dependent on the rest of the sentence. Take a look at what I mean. This sentence says the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. As long as is the subordinating conjunction in this sentence. Now, the organization will exist could be a sentence by itself. You put a period right there. And there is ample funding could also be a sentence by itself. Those two sentences could stand alone. But when we add to this first sentence, the organization will exist as long as, it makes the rest of the sentence, or it makes that sentence dependent on something else. Because if we were just to say the organization will exist as long as, that leaves us hanging. That's a fragment. It needs some other words to go along with it to make it a complete sentence. So the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. So as long as is the subordinating conjunction, making the first part of the sentence dependent on something else to complete the sentence. Let's look at one more example. Since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Since right here is the subordinating conjunction. Remember, I said a subordinating conjunction can be one word or a group of words. So up here, it was 3 words. Sometimes the subordinating conjunction is 2 words, and then often it is just 1 word, like since. So here it says, since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Now again, let's eat lunch could be a sentence by itself, and it is noon could be a sentence by itself. But when we add since to it is noon, it makes this part of the sentence dependent on some other words to complete the sentence. Because if we just said since it is noon, that wouldn't make any sense. That would be a fragment because it's incomplete. So a subordinating conjunction makes the rest of the sentence dependent on something else to complete it. That way, since it is noon, let's eat lunch makes sense. Sometimes choosing the correct pronoun can be difficult. Consider this sentence. Ron and blank left. So here, you either need to insert the pronoun Ron and I left or Ron and me left. So how do you choose the correct one? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you that the correct response is I. The sentence should read, Ron and I left. Now, there is a grammatical way to come to that conclusion, but there's an easy trick to figure it out. Try removing the first noun in the sentence. So if we remove Ron and then we just read the sentence like this, it's much more easy to figure out which pronoun to use. We can read the sentence 2 ways. We can try I left, or we can say me left. Me left obviously is not grammatically correct. So the correct pronoun here must be I left. So then that means we can plug I into the sentence, and the sentence makes sense, like Ron and I left. All right, let's look at another option, or another example. He gave Ron and blank a gift. He gave Ron and blank a gift. So here, do we insert the pronoun I or me? Well, let's try the trick again and remove Ron and from the sentence. So we can try it 2 ways. Once by inserting the pronoun I, and once by inserting the pronoun me. He gave me a gift. Or we could read it as, he gave I a gift. Here, I does not sound grammatically correct. So me must be the correct response, because he gave me a gift sounds grammatically correct. So me is the correct pronoun to insert in the blank. So the sentence now reads, he gave Ron and me a gift. And that is the correct way to do it. So again, the more you get familiar with these pronouns, the easier it will be to determine which pronoun to use. But you can always use the trick of eliminating one of the nouns in the sentence to figure out which pronoun you need. Notice one more thing, that I always put the pronouns second, because in this case, these sentences were referring to the speaker. So say these sentences are referring to myself. Out of respect for the other person, you should always put yourself last in the order of people. So it wouldn't be correct to say, I and Ron left, or he gave me and Ron a gift. It always is grammatically correct to put yourself after the other people in the sentence. Verbals are words that look like verbs but are not playing the role of a verb. Take a look at this example sentence. The smell of the flowers reached my nose. What is the subject of this sentence? Well, our first impulse would be to say that flowers is the subject because it's right next to the verb reached. In fact, I'll underline reached twice because it's a verb. But flowers is not the subject of the sentence because the flowers don't reach my nose. The smell reaches my nose. And this may confuse you because you think smell is a verb. But in this case, smell is actually a noun, and it's playing the role of the subject of the sentence in this case. Now think of another sentence, like I smell cake. In this case, I is the subject, and smell is the verb. So the word smell can play different roles. In this sentence, it's playing the role of a verb. But in this sentence, it's a verbal, and it's playing the role of a noun and as the subject of this sentence. Look at another example. Swimming is enjoyable. Here the verb is, and the subject of the sentence is swimming, but swimming could also be the verb of a sentence. But in this case, it's a verbal, so it's playing the role of a subject. Verbals can also be the object of a preposition, like this sentence, I am not pleased about going. So I is the subject, and am and pleased is the verb, about is a preposition, and going is the object of the preposition. So I is the subject, am and pleased are the verbs. So then what is going if going is not a verb? Well, about is a preposition, and every prepositional phrase and every preposition has an object of the preposition. So going is the object of the preposition. Why is it the object of the preposition? Because it further explains the preposition. Now look at this sentence. I hate taking my medicine. I is the subject, and hate is the verb. Now, the temptation here is to think that taking is the verb, or that hate taking collectively is the verb phrase. But hate is the only verb here. Taking can sometimes play the role of a verb, but in this case, it's a verbal, and so it's the object of the verb. That's the role taking's play. That's the role that taking is right there. It's the object of the verb. All right, last example. Listen to the soothing music. Listen's the verb. So soothing is not the verb. So what is soothing doing right here? Well, soothing is describing the music because it's telling you more about the music. It's describing the music. It's telling you that the music is soothing. So what is music? Well, music right here is just a noun. So soothing is describing music, and any word that describes a noun is an adjective. So here, soothing is playing the role of an adjective. So remember, a verbal is just a word that looks like a verb, but is playing a different role in the sentence. Understanding verb tenses is critical because verb tenses are used to show when a verb took place. So if you use the wrong verb, it makes your writing very confusing. So I'm going to look at 4 verb tenses. I have them written up here on the board. First one is the past tense. Then we have the present tense, the future tense, and the past participle tense. So I want to look at 2 verbs and see what they would look like in the different tenses. So first we have the past tense. Think about the verb walk. What would be the past tense of the verb walk? It would be walked. So even if I didn't have all this other stuff about verb tenses written up here on the board, and we just had the verb walked, anyone could look at that and know that that means that that happened in the past. He walked down the street. That verb right there is indicating that he walked in the past. All right, let's look at the present tense of the verb walked. It would be the verb walks. Now, present tense means that whatever is happening is occurring now. Now, it doesn't always mean that it's happening right now. So, like, think about the verb walks. If we say he walks to school, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is walking on the road right now headed to school. It just means that every day, currently, he walks to school. Let's look at the future tense. It will be will walk. That's the future tense of the verb walk. He will walk down the street. Again, you can just look at will walk and know that means something will happen in the future. Past participle is used to show that something happened in the past before something else happened. So it's going to be similar to the past tense, but just a little bit different. We're actually going to add what's called an auxiliary verb or a helping verb, which is the verb has. So we're going to say has walked. So up here, we would just say he walked down the street. Now we're saying he has walked down the street. It's showing that that happened in the past before something else happened. Now let's look at one more verb. How about the verb do? So the past would be did, as in he did that. The present tense would be does, as in he does that. The future tense will be will do. He will do that. And the past participle would be has done, as in he has done that. So again, it's critical that you understand verb tenses and that you apply what you know about verb tenses to use the correct verb tense in all of your writing.
Word choice and intended audience. When authors write, they choose their words very carefully. They want to precisely express what they are trying to get across. They aren't just throwing words out there haphazardly. They are choosing their words with a purpose. They want to get some message across to you. They want it to be clear how they feel about a subject, so they're going to use precise wording for that. Word choice is going to impact the tone and style of a piece of writing. If you use the word exultant versus happy, it's going to give a different tone than simply using happy. Exultant says it's so much more than that, and it's going to give a loftier tone to your piece. Style, same way. If the author's using flowery wording, if it's these lovely flowing sentences versus short wording, choppy little sentences, it's going to give a different flow to the writing and a different style. So the author is going to choose their wording very carefully. Another thing an author is going to consider when writing is their intended audience. They may write the same story differently for different audiences, and there are lots of different audience groups to consider. For instance, children, adults, teenagers, men, women, parents, and the list could go on and on for the type of audience groups that an author could target. But let's think about if an author's writing a story. They may write a story differently, leaving out some disturbing or provocative parts if they're writing for children, where they would put in those same parts if they're writing for adults. And if they're writing for teenagers, maybe they'd leave some of it in and keep some of it out. If an advertising agency was writing an ad for deodorant, they might write it differently if they were going to target men versus if they were going to target women. And same thing, if you were targeting parents in general as an advertising agency, you're going to talk to them differently than you would, say, people in their early 20s or teens that aren't interested in kids or diapers or formula or any of the things that are being advertised toward parents in general. So whenever an author's writing, they're going to consider their intended audience very carefully and make sure they're writing to most accurately entertain or reach out to that audience. Word choice and intended audience affect a text's content, style, and tone. And we discussed style and tone already. They are affected by word choice, and they can also be affected by the author's audience. If you're talking to a child, your tone may change, your style is going to have to change, your writing can't be as high level as it would be if you were talking to adults or even teenagers. And the content is going to vary based on your audience. Because you're going to leave some details out if they're too much for a child to handle, or if it's something that a man or a parent might not be interested in versus something that a teenager or a woman would be interested in. So, whenever you're writing, I want you to consider your word choice and intended audience, because you need to write just as any other author would write, considering your words carefully. Make sure you choose them with a purpose. You're writing and choosing words that are going to most clearly represent what your message is. And you're thinking of your audience. Who is most likely to read your paper?
There is a progression in the spelling of a compound. Many times it starts out as two words, becomes joined with a hyphen, and then becomes one word. Therefore, it is very important to consult a recent dictionary or online resource to determine how a compound should be spelled. Now remember that just because you join a compound with a hyphen in one instance doesn't mean you will always use a hyphen to join that compound. So it's important to evaluate a compound on a case-by-case basis to determine if the use of a hyphen is necessary. So I'm going to break down for you some of the most common instances when you should use hyphens. You should use a hyphen to join a compound when it is a compound adjective directly before the noun it describes. Here's a prime example. He wore a mud-stained shirt. So here, mud-stained is a compound adjective right before the noun it describes, which is shirt. If I were to say to you his shirt is mud-stained, it would not need a hyphen. Mud-stained would still be an adjective describing the shirt, but it would come after the noun it describes, not before. Then you also use hyphens to describe family relationships, such as brother-in-law, father-in-law, or mother-in-law. And then you use a hyphen when spelling out numbers. If you're spelling out a number anywhere from 21 to 99, you need to spell it out and use a hyphen. Now, once you get to a number above 99, such as 100, you still need to spell it out, but you don't need a hyphen. And then from there, if you're spelling out a number that would require you to use 3 words to spell it, then you just write out the digits that make up the number, such as 102. Now here we have 2 examples of the use of 2/3. Only 2/3 of the assembly were present. The proposition passed by a 2/3 majority. So you'll probably notice that here no hyphen is used, and here a hyphen is used. Well, in this case, 2/3 is an adjective. And remember that a compound adjective directly before the noun it describes needs to have a hyphen. So this is a compound adjective directly before the noun it describes. So it needs to be hyphenated. Now here you may be thinking that 2/3 is modifying assembly. But assembly is actually an object of a preposition. See, of is the preposition, and assembly is the object of the preposition. So really, you could just take the prepositional phrase out of the sentence, and it would read like this. Only 2/3 were present. Well, here, it's quite obvious that 2/3 is the noun of the sentence. So since it's a noun, not an adjective, it does not need a hyphen. So remember earlier I said you need to determine, or you need to evaluate a compound on a case-by-case basis to determine if the use of a hyphen is necessary. This is a great example of that. Here we have the same compound in both sentences, but since they're used in different ways, one needs a hyphen and the other doesn't. You also need hyphens when you have a compound that includes the word self. Now, there are some exceptions to this, such as selfless, which does not need a hyphen. When you use ex or pro before a word, you need a hyphen. Whenever you are writing out a sentence and the last word of the sentence won't quite make it on that line and you have to continue on the next line, it's appropriate to break up the word. However, you need to break it up between syllables. So giraffe, for example, has 2 syllables. So you couldn't just put a hyphen wherever you please, maybe after the R or the A. It has to be between the I and the R because you can't do a break in between a syllable. Now, if this doesn't work for you and it won't fit this way, then you can just leave an extra big space on that line and write the entire word on the next line. Also, you use a hyphen to avoid confusions with the spelling of a word. See, here you have the word integral and you want to add semi to it. Well, if you didn't have a hyphen here, the I's would be next to each other, which would create some confusion as to how to pronounce the word. So by putting a hyphen, it really clears things up. But there are some exceptions to this, such as coordinate. Most people don't even think of coordinate as a compound, but really this could be written with a hyphen between the 2 O's. But now this word is so commonplace that a hyphen is no longer needed. The introduction will always come at the beginning of an essay. The introduction is extremely important because it gives the reader an idea of what is to come. If your introduction is poorly written or poorly constructed, a reader may stop reading there and not even finish the rest of the essay. And if a teacher is reading your essay to grade it, the introduction is going to give them an idea of how the rest of the essay is going to be written. So if you write your introduction poorly, they're going to assume and go into reading the rest of the essay with the notion that the rest of the essay is poorly constructed and poorly written as well. So go ahead and make a great first impression and write and construct your introduction well. The introduction also contains your thesis statement. The thesis statement briefly states what the rest of the essay is going to be about. And so it makes sense that you would put the thesis statement first because it gives the reader an idea of what is to come. Tell what the essay will cover. Give them an idea of what they're about to read and why they need to read it. And make sure your introduction contains an explanation, kind of a summary about the essay. So again, the reader has an idea of what is to come. The introduction sets the stage for the rest of your essay. It's extremely important, but make sure that it contains a thesis statement, tells what the essay will cover, and contains an explanation of the rest of the essay. and you'll be on your way to writing success. ACT English Sentence Structure. Linking verbs do not express action. Instead, linking verbs express a state of being. So you have action verbs and linking verbs. And so linking verbs are reserved for expressing a state of being. So an example is, John was a doctor. Was here is a linking verb, and it's expressing a state of being, John being a doctor. And then the grapefruit here is too sour. The grapefruit is too sour. So is the linking verb here, and again it's expressing a state of being because it's describing grapefruit. So in addition to was and is, some other linking verbs are am, are, were, be, being, and been. Now, a noun or an adjective is going to follow a linking verb. So when an adjective follows a linking verb, it describes the subject. So an example is, this fruit is mushy. So we already know that is a linking verb. And so we look at the word following the linking verb, and we know it has to be a noun or an adjective. And we know that mushy is an adjective, and so it must be describing the subject. And sure enough, mushy is describing the subject, which is fruit. Now, when a noun follows a linking verb, it renames the subject. So here we have he is a doctor. Again, the linking verb is, and so the word following it is doctor. And so we know that doctor is a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. And sure enough it is, because doctor and he are interchangeable here because they're referring to the same person. Now, some sense-related verbs can also act as linking verbs, such as feel, look, smell, sound, and taste. And then there's some other verbs in general that can sometimes act as linking verbs, like appear, become, grow, and seem. And so we have some verbs that can be either an action verb or a linking verb, depending on their meaning in a sentence. Some examples are appear, become, feel, grow, look, smell, sound, and taste. So right here we're using the verb grew. So here is an example of it as a linking verb. Mary grew ill. And so a linking verb is going to have a noun or an adjective following it. So here we have ill, which is an adjective. And so since it's an adjective, it must be describing the subject. And sure enough it is. It's describing Mary. It's saying that Mary is ill. Now here we have an action verb. We grew tomatoes. It's the same word, but this time it's acting as an action verb. Now pretend for a second that it is a linking verb. We look at the word tomatoes and we see that it's a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. Well, we and tomatoes aren't interchangeable because we and tomatoes are not the same thing. So we know that grew here must be an action verb. So you just have to base it off the context of the sentence when you're trying to decide whether a verb is acting as a linking verb or an action verb. But when you come up to these words up here, these verbs are always going to be linking verbs. But when you come to sense-related verbs as well as some other verbs, they can act as a linking or action verb. Whenever you are writing, you want to make sure that your sentences are distinct. So in order to do that, your sentences should be specific. When sentences aren't specific, you as the author are not telling very much to the reader. So look at this sentence, for example. He does well at school sometimes. Well, this sentence right here doesn't really tell you that much. We have a pronoun right here, the pronoun he, so we don't know who he is. We just know he does well at school. We don't know how well. And then we just know he does well at school sometimes. And so we don't know when those sometimes are. Now, we could rephrase this sentence, add some more details in it, and totally transform the sentence. So we could say, Darius does excellent at school on Fridays. So before we just had this pronoun right here, he. Now we have a proper noun, Darius, so we know who he is. And earlier we knew that he did well, but we didn't know how well. Now we know that he does excellent. Excellent is more of a descriptive word. And then Before, we didn't know when he did well at school. We just knew he did well at school sometimes. Now we know that he always does well at school on Fridays. So both of these sentences are structured the same. However, you learn a lot more, or you get a lot more information from this sentence than you do the first sentence. So let's take a look at a second example. He went over there. Again, we don't know who he is because there's just a pronoun there. We know that he went somewhere. We don't know how he went. We don't know if he was in a car or walking or jogging or running or riding a bike or a skateboard. And it says he went over there. And we don't know where there is. But again, by adding more details, by making the sentence more specific, we can give the reader a lot more information. So now we can write Darius walked to the park. So now we know who he is because we were using a pronoun. Now we're using a proper noun. And we just knew before that he went somewhere. We didn't know how he got there. Now we know that he walked. And before we didn't know where he was going. Now we know that he went to the park. So by making our sentence more distinct and making it more specific, we conveyed or told the reader a lot more information. ACT English Strategy. I want to go over 4 methods to obtain coherence in writing. So when I talk about coherence, I'm talking mainly about consistency. And so one method is by the repetition of key phrases or words. And so when you repeat key phrases or words, you are establishing consistency in your writing because the reader can see your consistency because you're using the same phrases and words over and over. A second method is the use of personal pronouns. So this sentence says, Joe's dog walked around Joe's leg. Now, Joe's right here that's underlined is the only one that should remain. We should remove Joe's right here and replace it with his, because when we use Joe's twice, it begins to confuse the reader because they think we're talking about more than one Joe. And so by using this personal pronoun right here of his, it increases the comprehension on the reader's part, which in turn increases coherence. Because even if you have consistency in your writing, if the reader can't comprehend what you're writing, they're not going to be able to see the consistency in your writing. A third method is the use of synonyms. So this first sentence says he went on a hike with his colleague. Now, say you don't know what the word colleague means. Well, you progress to the next sentence and read, it was his first time to hang out with a coworker. So you can easily see that colleague and coworker are indeed synonyms. And so if you did not know what colleague meant, you probably know what coworker means. And so you can just figure out what colleague means by saying that it's a synonym with coworker. And so again, this increases comprehension, which helps for consistency. Now, the fourth method is the use of parallel construction. And so parallel construction is when you have items in a series and you approach each item in the series the same way. And so this sentence says, I went to the grocery store, the car wash, and ate lunch at the food court. And so each item in this series does not have the same grammatical setup. See, you should be able to apply the first 3 words of this sentence to each part of the series. You should be able to say, I went to the grocery store, which you can, as well as I went to the car wash, and then I went to ate lunch at the food court. See, the first 2 parts of this series make sense, but the third part doesn't. You have to rephrase this sentence for it to make more sense. You can say, I went to the grocery store, the car wash, and to the food court to eat lunch. And so those are 4 methods to obtain coherence in your writing.
Parentheses. Parentheses are used to designate which operations, which is addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, should be done first when there are multiple, so more than one, operations. For example, 4 minus the quantity 2 plus 1. Since 2 plus 1 is inside the parentheses, we must perform that operation first. We must add 2 plus 1 first. So 4 minus 3, which yields 1. If we had not added 2 plus 1 first, then 4 minus 2 would be 2, plus 1 would give us 3. So there would be a different answer. So that's why we need to know that parentheses mean that we do that operation first.
ACT, English sentence structure. There are 3 verb tenses that I want to take a look at. And those verb tenses are present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect. So the present perfect is used to emphasize the completion of an action in the very recent past. So here's an example. I have just purchased a necklace. So this is something that was completed in the very recent past. It was just completed. Person just purchased a necklace. Now, the present perfect can also be used to indicate an action begun in the past and continued to the present moment. So here's an example of that. Sam has lived in the same house for 10 years. So this is talking about something that is happening now and may have happened for a long time, but the reason we're still calling it the present perfect is because it's coming up all the way till the present. And then we have the past perfect, which indicates how 2 finished actions are related in time. So the example here is before he went blind, Milton had written Paradise Lost. So we're looking at 2 actions here, Milton going blind and Milton writing Paradise Lost. Both of these are finished actions. And so this sentence is showing that Milton wrote Paradise Lost before he went blind. So here, the first completed action is using the past perfect, while the second action is using the simple past. And then we come to future perfect, which indicates an action to be finished before a future time. So the example for that is, I will have finished the book before I take the exam. So this is an action that has not happened yet, but is going to eventually be finished. And the sentence is telling the reader before what event that action is going to be completed. See, the writer is saying they're going to finish the book before the event of taking the exam. So that's a look at present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect verb tenses. A thesis statement is a very important part of a paper because it basically tells the reader what your paper is going to be about. And every part of your paper has to go along with the thesis statement. So consider your thesis statement as an umbrella. So here's the umbrella. And so all of your points have to fit in under the umbrella. Point 1 has to, and point 2. And if any point tries to get out here and doesn't quite fit under the thesis statement and doesn't quite talk about the same things as the thesis statement, you have 2 choices. You can expand your umbrella. In other words, expand your thesis statement to include point 3, or you just have to remove point 3 and not talk about that point. But the important thing is that everything in your paper refers back to your thesis statement. It's the guide for your whole paper. It's what holds it together, because otherwise you have a paper with lots of different concepts. And the thesis statement is the unifying sentence of the paper that brings it all together. The thesis statement needs to go near the beginning of the paper. Now notice I said near the beginning, not at the very beginning. Generally, needs to be the last sentence of the first paragraph. So you put in your paper some introductory information, and then you close off the paragraph with the thesis statement, which lets the reader know what the paper is going to be about. And then at various times throughout the paper, you may repeat the thesis statement just in slightly different form, especially in the conclusion of the paper. So a good thesis statement tells what the paper is going to be about, and generally is pretty specific. It's not very broad. It tells the reader almost exactly what the paper is going to be dealing with. So those are some important things to remember when using thesis statements. After determining your own opinion and evaluating the credibility of your supporting text, it is sometimes necessary to communicate your ideas and findings to others. So that's when writing a response to a text comes in. And the purpose of writing a response to the text is to communicate your ideas and findings to others. So I want to look at some of the supporting evidence that you can use when writing a response to the text. It's important that when you're writing this response that you don't just put in your own opinions, but you also put in facts from the text. So some of the things you can put in there are facts, details, statistics, and direct quotations. So what you want to do is look in the text and find things like this that you think will back up your arguments, because you're communicating your ideas and findings to other people. So you want to find the best way to communicate those ideas and findings. So look for facts, details, statistics, and direct quotations that back up your ideas and findings. So what you need to do is take info from the original text, which is all this up here. Take that info first and then base all of your discussion, arguments, and defense off of this information from the text. Notice the difference here when not using supporting evidence. So consider like we're not even using all this. Then you're discussing your ideas, you're discussing your findings, you're arguing your findings, and you're offering a defense for your findings and ideas. Well, why should the reader trust you? That's where it's important to have this supporting evidence when writing a response to the text. ACT, English strategy. When an author is engaged in a cause and effect analysis, then the author is primarily concerned with explaining why something happens or in describing the consequences of something. And so authors have different goals of a cause and effect analysis. But there are three common goals that a writer may have. One is to outline previously unknown consequences of a familiar event. Another is to speculate about possible causes for a known problem. And a third common reason is to show how one thing influences another. So a writer may pick any of these reasons to write a cause and effect analysis. Now, it is not necessary for the author to assert a firm conclusion in a cause and effect analysis. So the author doesn't need a firm conclusion. Often, just asking some pointed questions will be sufficient. So that's kind of a look at the author's side of a cause and effect analysis. However, the reader does have some responsibilities when reading a cause and effect analysis. It's important that you as the reader always consider whether the arguments made by the author are both sensible and coherent. ACT English strategy. When the author is dealing with a complex or extremely detailed subject, he or she will often use the rhetorical strategy of classification and division in order to simplify things for the reader. So classification and division means organizing the material of an essay into distinct categories. It makes it more understandable for the reader. It makes it easier for the reader to follow all of the author's points. And so when an author uses the rhetorical strategy of classification and division, both the author and the reader have particular responsibilities. So the author's responsibility is to state the system being used. In other words, they should be stating which classification and division system they are being used. It's always important for the author to state explicitly what they're using in the text. Now, the reader's responsibility is to evaluate the author's choice. And what I mean by evaluating the author's choice is when the author uses that classification or division system to organize a complex subject, the reader needs to consider whether the classification system chosen by the author is appropriate for the subject matter. In other words, don't be a lazy reader. Take what you're reading and evaluate it and decide whether the author is being effective with their choice of classification and division. ACT English strategy. Sometimes an author will want to compare and contrast two or more subjects or ideas. To compare something means to consider the similarities between it and something else. And to contrast something means to consider its differences with something else. And so sometimes a writer will want to compare something with something else and contrast something with something else. And so the writer incorporates that into a compare and contrast essay where the writer can do both. Now, in one of those essays, the author may choose one of two organizational strategies. So the first strategy is the separation strategy, which is where the author fully describes one subject before moving on to another. And the second is the point-by-point strategy, which is where the author will compare and contrast two subjects, one part at a time. And so consider if a writer was talking about peaches and pears. So the author wants to compare and contrast peaches and pears. If the author was using the separation strategy, the author would first fully describe pears, talking about all the different facets of pears, and then the author would switch to and talk about everything there is to know about peaches. But if the author uses the point-by-point strategy, the author compare and contrast two subjects one part at a time. So first, the author might compare and contrast the pears and the peaches color. And then the writer might move on to water content. And depending on how much alike or how much different pears and peaches are when it comes to water content, the writer will either compare or contrast the pears and peaches on that point. And then the author will move on to another part and talk about taste. And so point-by-point strategy is going back and forth between the two items, where the separation strategy is just that. It separates the two items to talk about them individually. So again, to compare something is to consider the similarities between it and something else. And to contrast something is to consider its differences with something else. ACT English strategy. A description is a detailed record of the sensory perceptions of some person, place, or thing. In many cases, an author will seek to make a point through their description. So consider if a writer wrote about the way a rose smells, or the way hot pavement feels on bare feet, or the sound of your mother's voice. All of those would be forms of description. And the reason all of those would be forms of description is because if a writer wrote about these things, then they would be providing a detailed record of the sensory perceptions of some person, place, or thing. So if a writer wrote about the way a rose smells, the writer would be talking about the sensory perception of smell to a person. Or if they wrote about the way hot pavement feels on bare feet, they would be talking about the sensory perception of touch to to whoever has the bare feet. Or they might be talking about the sound of your mother's voice. So they're talking about the sensory perception of hearing, and they're talking about that in terms of whoever is hearing their mother's voice. Now, sometimes an author will use short descriptions to give the reader a sense of the emotional content of the topic. Now, it's important as you're reading to evaluate the descriptive details the reader is using. So there's a couple of things you should look for when evaluating these details. One is you should make sure that the details advance the author's point. If the details aren't advancing the author's point, then they're irrelevant and they're cumbersome to the reader, and they're distracting from the main point that the author is trying to make. And the descriptive details should also make the text more enjoyable. If the descriptive details don't make the text more enjoyable, then again, that means the facts are probably irrelevant, or there's just too many of them, and so they're becoming cumbersome to the reader. And again, they're distracting from the author's main point. So you as the reader should be constantly evaluating whether the descriptive details included by the author advance the author's point and make the text more enjoyable, or if they are just distracting and irrelevant. ACT English strategy. The word narrative is a synonym for story. So when an author tells a story, he or she is engaging in narration. So there's a few reasons why an author tells a story. Two of the main ones are for, one, the entertainment value of the story, and another is to convey a larger point. So sometimes the reader is not worried about conveying a point, but they are just telling a story just for the purpose of the entertainment value of that story. And other times it's to convey a larger point to the reader. Now, as a reader, you should constantly evaluate the ways in which the author uses narration to accomplish his or her goals. Now, there's a couple of keys to the effective use of narration. One is the point of the story should be self-evident. It should be obvious to the reader why the author is telling that story. And then a second key is the author shouldn't include any unrelated or contradictory details. Anytime the author uses unrelated or contradictory details, it undermines his or her own agenda. And so those are a couple of things that you as a reader should be looking for to evaluate whether or not the writer used narration effectively. ACT English strategy. A text is said to be engaged in the rhetorical strategy of persuasion when it attempts to convince the reader of a certain fact or opinion through the use of reasoning. So the rhetorical strategy of persuasion is when the writer is trying to convince the reader through the use of reasoning. Now, there's a couple of criteria that an essay needs to meet in order to be an effective persuasive essay. So a writer needs to make sure they incorporate these two criteria into any persuasive essay they're writing. So the first one is an effective persuasive essay is somewhat objective. In addition to that, an effective persuasive essay favors one side of the argument. Now, you may be thinking that these are contradictory statements, but these two statements can coexist in an essay. Now, the reason a writer needs to be somewhat objective is that a persuasive essay that does not seriously and reasonably assess the arguments of the other side will not be able to convince an impartial and thoughtful reader. So that's why it's important to be somewhat objective. The essay can't be overly weighted to one side. The writer or the reader needs to feel that the writer weighed both sides of the argument and that they're giving facts from both sides of the argument. Now, in order to be a persuasive essay, however, the essay cannot be totally objective. It has to favor one side of the argument. Now, an informational essay could be totally objective, but in order to be a persuasive essay, the writer does need to favor one side of the argument. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the writer trying to push one side of the argument. It's just important that they're objective enough that they get some trust with the reader. Now, because the writer is trying to persuade the reader, it's very important in persuasive essays that the reader take care to separate matters of fact from matters of opinion. And so you're probably already familiar with this concept. A matter of fact would be, he was born in 1953. Now, a matter of opinion was, or a matter of opinion is, he was a nice man. So these are really very elementary examples of matters of fact and matters of opinion. But notice here, he was born in 1953 as a fact. This is undisputable. But he was a nice man is disputable. People have different ideas of what nice means, and they have a different idea of whether or not this person was a nice man. So it's important that you as a reader are distinguishing between the matters of fact that the writer uses and the matters of opinion that the writer uses, so that you as a reader are not being deceived by the writer. ACT, English sentence structure. A sentence can be identified according to its structure. So the 4 different types of structures are simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, and compound complex sentence. So a simple sentence is made up of just an independent clause. An independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself. So here's an example. It rained yesterday. So we have a subject here, it, and a verb, rained. And so this sentence isn't dependent on anything else to be a complete sentence. It's a sentence in its own right because it can stand alone. It rained yesterday is a grammatically correct sentence. So we call that an independent clause. Now, a compound sentence is made up of 2 or more independent clauses. Now I'm just going to write here IC for independent clause. And so an example of a compound sentence is, she likes to eat fruit and I like to eat vegetables. So notice here that we have a subject and a verb. She likes to eat fruit, and a subject and a verb. I like to eat vegetables. So this is an independent sentence because it could be a sentence by itself, and this is an independent sentence because we could just say, I like to eat vegetables, and that's a sentence by itself. But notice here we have them joined together by a comma and the conjunction and. And so there's a few ways you can join 2 independent clauses together. One is by that example right there, by a comma and a conjunction. And so and is a conjunction as well as words like for, but, so, and yet. And then we can also join 2 independent clauses by just a semicolon. So right here we could take out the comma and just put a semicolon. It's less common, but it's still grammatically correct. And another way is just to put a conjunction with no comma. Now that wouldn't really be grammatically correct in this sentence right here, but I'm going to show you a sentence in a little bit where this would be appropriate. You only need to do that when you have 2 short independent clauses being joined together. Now the third sentence structure is a complex sentence. It has 1 independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. So I'm going to write here independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. So an example of that is, because I like to drink milk, my bones are very strong. Now here you see the subject I and the verb like. So you have I like to drink milk. You have a subject and a verb, but this is not a complete sentence. This is a dependent clause because of this word right here, because. If you were to say, because I like to drink milk, that wouldn't be a complete sentence. You need something else to it to finish it out. So that's why we call this a dependent clause, because it's dependent on another clause to be complete. Now here, on the other side of this comma, we have an independent clause. Here we have a subject, bones, and a verb, are. So my bones are very strong, can stand alone. So it's joined together with this dependent clause with a comma. Now, dependent clauses can also come after the independent clause, and you could have more than 1 dependent clause in a complex sentence. Now, a dependent clause is usually introduced by a relative pronoun, such as who, which, that, or something else like that. Or a subordinating conjunction, maybe like although, because, or when. Now finally, we get to the 4th sentence structure, which is a compound complex sentence, which is 2 or more independent clauses plus 1 or more dependent clauses. So we have 2 independent clauses and at least 1 dependent clause. And so an example of that is the plane arrived and we took off because we were already late. So right here we have plane as the subject and arrived as the verb. And then here we have we as the subject and took as the verb. So this is an independent clause right here because it can stand alone. And this is an independent clause. Now right here we have a dependent clause. Now again, we have a subject and we have a verb. We and were are the subject and verb here, but this is not an independent clause. If we were to take the word because off, it would be an independent clause. We were already late. But because of the word because, it's now a dependent clause. Now right here you may be thinking, we have 2 independent clauses here joined by just a conjunction and no comma, because what you're used to seeing is a comma right here, which that is appropriate. We could also just put a semicolon right here. That would also be appropriate to join the 2 independent clauses. But we can actually not use a semicolon and we can not use a comma and just have a conjunction, because this is one of the cases where, like I was saying earlier, you just need a conjunction because you have 2 short independent clauses. So again, the 4 sentence structure types are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. Text structure is basically the way that descriptions are organized. So we're going to take a look at a few different text structures. So the first is cause and effect. Basically what happens here is one event leads to another. So here it says Abigail did not wipe her feet, so she got mud on the carpet. So we have the cause, which is Abigail did not wipe her feet, and the effect of that is she got mud on the carpet. So one event, the event of her not wiping her feet, leads to another event, in this case, her getting mud on the carpet. And so cause and effect is a very common way to order information because it tells you what happened first, and then it tells you what happened as a result of that. Now, a second type of text structure is chronological order. And so this goes from the past, many times, to the present. Or we could say it this way, it gives you an order of events. It says, I got in the car, drove to the store, and bought oranges. Now, the writer of this wouldn't say they drove to the store, bought oranges, got in the car. Because what had to happen here is first the person got in the car, then they drove to the store, and then they bought oranges. If you mix it up, it confuses the reader. So the idea of text structures is to make your writing very clear. And so chronological order helps the author make themselves very clear because it tells each event as it happened. And then we have spatial order. This isn't quite as common, but it's the way things are placed in an area. So the example I have here is the room has tall ceilings, walls covered with beautiful paintings, elaborate furniture, and wood floors. So spatial order never jumps around. It goes in a very clear way. There's a very clear progression to it. So first it talks about the ceiling. So if you walk into a room, you look up and you see it has tall ceilings. And then you look at all the walls and you notice the elaborate paintings. And then your eyes go down a little bit further and you notice the elaborate furniture. And then finally you look all the way down to the ground and you see the wood floors. Now, there's not really one right way to do spatial order. We could have started the other way. We could have looked at the wood floors, the furniture, the paintings, and then the ceilings. But the point here is have some clear progression to your ideas. Maybe you have a table of people sitting down. You wouldn't, and you're talking about each person at the table. You wouldn't jump around all over the table. You'd go in a circle talking about each person at the table. You're doing the same thing here. You shouldn't talk about the ceilings, then talk about the floor, and then talk about the walls, and then talk about what's sitting on the floor. You should have a very clear progression to everything that you're talking about. So once again, cause and effect, chronological order, and spatial order are all text structures. Now there are other text structures, but these are some of the most common. ACT, English sentence structure. Adjectives can be used to compare people, places, or things different in degree. So if you have a one-syllable adjective, you use the suffix er or s, or the words in front of it less or least. So say we have the word new, and then we want to make the comparative form of new. We add the suffix er to make it newer. And if we're trying to compare it with 3 or more objects, then we would put est as the suffix to make it newest. So that's the superlative form. So say you have one car and it's only a month old. You would say you have a new car. Now, if you have a car that's 1 month old and another car that's 2 months old, you would say that the 1 month old car is the newer car. Now, if you're dealing with 3 cars, one's a month old, one's 2 months old, and the other one's 3 months old, you would refer to the car that's a month old as the newest car. Now, this is in the positive sense, whichever one is newer. Now, if we're looking at this more in the negative sense, we could say the comparative form would be less new, and the superlative form would be the least new. So if you have 2 cars, again, you would refer to the one that's 2 months old, the older car, as being less new. And you would refer to the oldest car, if you have 3 or more cars, as being the least new. Now, if you have a 2-syllable adjective ending in y, you use the suffix er or est, or you use the words less or least. So say you have the word hungry, you're going to drop the y and change it to I and add er. So change the y to I and add er, so you get hungrier. It's similar with the superlative form. You change the y to I and add est, so you have hungriest. So if you have one person, you would describe them as hungry. With 2 people, you would describe one person as being hungrier, or describe the other person as being less hungry. If you have 3 or more, you would describe one person as being the hungriest, or you would describe someone as being the least hungry. Now, if you have a word with 2 or more syllables, use more or most or less or least. So notice here we're no longer using suffixes. So if something is thrilling and you're comparing it with something else, you would say that one is more thrilling. And then if you have 3 or more, you would describe something as being the most thrilling. And then in the same way as before, you would describe one as being less thrilling or the least thrilling. So say you have one amusement park ride somewhere. You would describe it as thrilling. But if you're dealing with 2 rides, you would describe one as being more thrilling. But if you have a whole amusement park full of rides, you would describe one as being the most thrilling. Now, there are some words that we call irregular. And they're irregular in the way that we form their comparative and superlative. A great example of that is the word bad. The comparative form is worse than, which isn't even another form of bad. And then the superlative form is the worst. So that's a look at unequal comparison adjectives. ACT, English style. Word usage, or diction, refers to the use of words with meanings and forms that are appropriate for the context and structure of a sentence. So this right here is your goal as a writer, to use words with meanings and forms appropriate for the context and appropriate for the structure of a sentence. Now, a common error in word usage occurs when a word's meaning does not fit the context of the sentence. This sentence right here says, Susie likes chips better than candy. Now, the appropriate word here is than, not then. Then is an inappropriate word for the context of the sentence. So it makes more sense to say Susie likes chips better than candy, because than is used in comparisons, while then is used in more of a chronological sense, like I went to the store, then I ate lunch. Another example would be the cat licked its coat. The correct form is the cat licked its coat. Now, its and its are homonyms, which are words that sound the same but have different meanings. And you may be thinking, anytime a word is possessive, shouldn't it have an apostrophe? Which generally that is the case, and here its should be possessive. But with the case of the word its, you only use an apostrophe when you're talking about the contraction. So right here, the sentence is saying the cat licked it is cold. So that doesn't make sense, so obviously you're not supposed to use the apostrophe. Now, I just mentioned homonyms. And errors in word usage frequently occur with homonyms, which again are words that sound alike but have different meanings. So some examples of homonyms are it's and it, effect and effect, and there, and there. So it's very easy for a writer to confuse these words because they sound the same. Now some other words that are commonly confused are then and except and except. Now these words aren't homonyms, but they're very close to being homonyms because they don't sound exactly alike, but they are pretty close, which makes determining which word to use a little bit more difficult.